Good afternoon, and thank you all. I hope everyone had a little bit of a break. It is a beautiful sunshiny day out, but a little cool. So we'll continue. We will open up the afternoon session with RC 17, Health.
Well, I think no introduction is needed to Alicia. Alicia, you've been living here, so thank you for all of your work on behalf of the parents and the community and the children and the staff here. So thank you, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Before I present my budget, I just wanted to take a moment to personally thank the board and the cabinet for your support of me and of the nursing department this year. I've been shown so much kindness and generosity and public recognition, and the nursing staff has been the beneficiaries of that as well. And so we truly appreciate that recognition. I remain ever hopeful that we'll see COVID disappear from our lives completely and we won't face another unprecedented year. But until then, we will continue making every effort to keep our schools safe and open for all kids. In looking at our budget, there are two areas where we've asked for an increase in funding. One is under RC 17, and I've asked for an increase in funding in the supply line due to the cost of medical waste disposal, and also we're also seeing an increase in pricing for all PPE, gloves, masks, gowns, due to the pandemic. The medical waste disposal covers the cost of disposing appropriately all expired medication and EpiPens and the sharps and any soiled PPE that we need to dispose of. And then under RC 17, as we've discussed in the past, and nursing positions are found in RC 17 and RC 24. And then under RC 24, we are requesting a 0.2 increase in the nursing support due to students with complex medical needs who require nursing care and procedures that happen throughout the day that can't be delegated to our non-medical personnel. And that is my budget. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Alicia, and appreciate your comments. And I know the board and parents, students, and the staff so appreciate all the hard work of you and your team during these challenging times. So I don't think there's never enough thank yous for their 24/7 commitment you and the team have shown to the district and trying to keep our students and staff safe. So thank you. I will open it up to questions and comments. Excuse me, RC 17 Health to the board. Mrs. Ritchie.
Thank you, Alicia. You do a great job. All the nurses do a great job. Thank you for all your hard work. And I'm impressed with 2.13%. Are you sure that's enough based on what we potentially may see in the fall and the COVID impact of how we do nursing in the schools going forward?
It's really hard to know. I would have considered this to be a budget buster year. And I think that we have towards the end of the budget here, a COVID expense budget. And I think that's where we're kind of finding those added COVID expenses. So, it's not reflected in RC 17, but I think it's reflected there. And, I'm hoping that will be, hopefully we won't need it.
Mrs. Achman.
So just on that point, if we can reserve some conversation and time for health when we discuss our new COVID RC, because I think there's some discussion there that might.
Thank you, Mrs. Achman. Mr. Sini?
Yeah, and along those lines, we can confirm that this budget, other than the new RC, does not have any assumption for a pandemic we're budgeting for a regular year, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. We're assuming a normal school year.
Okay, normal school year. And then
yep. Thank you, Mr. Senior. Mrs. Ritchie?
So I guess just to add on that, I don't know what normal looks like anymore. So I'm just concerned, and we can talk about it more when we get to that RC. I'm just concerned that things aren't going to be normal the way they used to be. So I just want everybody to keep in mind that it could be a COVID expense, but it could be a recurring COVID expense that we see for a long time coming. So
I
thank
think
you.
I think it's all good conversation. I think there are conversations around what we've learned and what we think we have to do going forward in a regular school year that will be built into the normal budget. And then there are those expenses that may come up because of ongoing COVID issues as we go into the new year. So good points, and we'll reserve further conversation for that. Any additional board comments or conversations around health? RC 17. We're going to change it up a little. And now that our friend Michelle knows all the players on our partners, she will ask any of those folks that have questions and go through kind of our roster of folks before opening it up to public comment. Michelle?
If there are any committee members with questions, please raise your hand and I will call you accordingly. We'll start with Mr. Jack Davis. You are unmuted and recognized.
We have no questions at this time, but want to thank the nurses for all their work. Thank you.
Julie Bess, you have your hand raised. You are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. We have no questions, but couldn't pass up the opportunity to say thank you.
Any more committee members with questions, please raise your hand. There are no raised hands at this time.
I will go to any comments or questions on RC 17 health from the general public that's on the call.
There are no raised hands at this time.
Thank you, Michelle. We will move on to a review of RC 22 technology education.
Hi,
Hello, Greg. How are you, Mr. Darren? Welcome. Thank you, sir.
I'm well, Dr. Adley. Thank you. And thank you, board members, for dedicating so much time, especially on a Saturday, to go through this process and having the interest in mind of our students at heart. So I'll go over RC 22 and some of the noticeable differences and changes that you may see here. One of those being a 50% drop in the tech ed teaching supplies. That is attributed to some Project Lead the Way startup costs that were allocated for this budget year, and we will not need them for the next budget year. Also built into that are some increases in some lumber costs for supplies of that sort, as well as sustaining the existing Project Lead the Way courses. You'll see professional development increasing by about 68% or $1,100. And I just believe that our staff can seek some new opportunities in the spring. We traditionally have one conference in the fall for our specific content area. And I just think there's a lot of opportunities out there for growth in our staff. And I'm a firm believer in professional development. So I hope to increase some of that. And for equipment, there is no new requested equipment for this particular year, but I do believe that there is some antiquated equipment. So over the next 3 to 5 years, I'm just looking to replace slowly a couple of our antiquated machines.
Thank you, Mr. Darren. We will open it up to board questions and comments. Mrs. McCammon.
This was a better question for library, excuse me, but I think we can address it here as well. It might be better for Dr. Adley, but the libraries have a printer in their budget. Can you explain why it doesn't belong in the copy center? Why there's one separately for the libraries?
Hi, it's Joan McGettigan. I am happy to respond to that. So these are smaller printers and they are needed for specific library materials. So we're talking about special kinds of paper that's used for book covers, spines, barcoding. It's very, very specific to the library. And so for the past few years, our librarians have actually been printing these materials at home and bringing them in because it's something that you really don't want to try and run through a large copier. It's very, very specific to the library.
Go ahead, Mrs. McCammon.
I wondered if we could talk a little bit about what professional development looks like at this stage. I know we have different kinds of professional development, so more specifically focused on what is relevant to this RC. But I know, I think that now that we've done this huge rollout because of the pandemic, can you talk about what the initiatives are that we're trying to build on as we go into this next fiscal year?
Right. So some of the conferences that I've attended in my past experience that I think my staff can benefit from, and you'll see that on the narrative as well. There's a career and technical education conference, often in Middletown, that just collaborates with a lot of teachers over the state as well as industry. And they just talk about the need for students to develop the skills in this field. I'd like to get everybody involved in that. There are some conferences related to technology in terms of iPad usage. And there is the Sika Castle Conference is another one as well that's related to educational technology in the field. And there's some great workshops that I've been to, and I would encourage staff to do so as well.
Any additional, Mrs. Ockman?
So we heard that we'll see some new STEM classes coming to the board. Is anything needed for those STEM classes anticipated in the budget pages we have here?
So the new classes generally, one of them is an accounting course, and there's just some textbooks that were a part of RC01 to support that course. There is an app development course where the software is actually free, and that'll help support that without including any licensing. And some changes to courses. There are some kind of a few additional supplies that are built into the supplied budget. So there's not a large cost for the new courses.
Okay, so any cost would be included in this budget already? We don't
Correct.
anticipate, okay, perfect, thank you.
Any additional, Mrs. McCammon?
Can you please develop a little bit more what's happening with staffing, how well the additional staff person this year has helped, what you see this coming year, and sort of give us this current year, next year, and maybe what we're thinking about going forward in terms of staffing and tech support?
You just want the additional staffing this year?
Yeah.
It's a different RC.
Yeah, it's not in this.
That's the general technology budget, RC 15.
Yeah. We will get to that question. All right. Any additional questions or comments from the board?
However,
Yes,
on
Mrs.
Mrs. McCammon's
Ockman.
question, we are anticipating a new person around here for teaching in classes to help out. So can you explain how that will help cover some of the new classes and just staffing wise, right? We see it at the high school for someone to help teach some of these new STEM classes in computer science and things like that.
Yeah, so we're increasing the 0.6. We'll make the 0.4 teacher that we have 1.0, and that's a computer science, and that will offset and allow some sections that Greg talked about here, the new courses to be taught in the technology section. So it's sort of a wee bit of a trade-off to open up some of the technology courses and expansion for them. That's kind of how it connects.
My understanding is some of those tech ed classes are very, very full and very, very difficult to get into because they're popular. So this will also help new offerings and sections for kids to get a chance to experience more STEM.
That is correct. These are specific new offerings, open it up, trying to expand the opportunities for kids under the STEM. Yes.
Thank you. Additional questions or comments? I will turn it over to Michelle for additional committee comments.
If any committee members have questions, please raise your hand at this time. Jack Davis, you are unmuted and recognized.
This is Jack Davis. We have no questions, but once again, can you turn on my video? Thank you.
You're all set, Mr. Davis.
And there he is.
There are no more raised hands for any committee members.
Thank you. I will open it up to. I will.
Sit down, Jack.
I will open it up to. I will open it up to public comment and questions.
There are no raised hands from the public.
Okay, thank you all very much. We will continue moving along to RC 15, technology.
Thank you, Greg. Is Mr. Adams on the?
I am here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Mr. Adams, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, esteemed board members, fellow administrators. I'm here to present the budget for RC 15, Information Technology. Joining me today is Dr. Joan McGettigan. She will speak to the instructional items in this budget. Excuse me. We're seeing a significant increase in this RC this year, in part due to the pandemic. The district has seen its one-to-one initiative become a necessity, providing devices for students from not just grades 5 to 12, but from pre-K to grade 12. The need for technology support for the district has also increased, both in number of devices and in response time. The number of devices in use simultaneously by the district has increased by over 300%. Response time also requires a reduction from hours to minutes. In an environment where technology is so prevalent, if a student's device is not working, they're not learning. Our infrastructure requires an increase in equipment and internet bandwidth to efficiently handle the significant increase of dependence on technology. Finally, digital software to accompany and support teaching becomes that much more important. This budget reflects this district's shift in technology. In this quick presentation, I will highlight the major increases in the budget. I will also discuss what is not here. We are very close to a bare bones budget that will simply maintain the technology status quo. Included here is what we believe will maintain the current learning environment for the students and staff. First line item I'd like to highlight would be 11044, which is technology support staffing. At the beginning of the school year, the board recommended the district hire 2 more technology support staff members. The department has hired 1 and has reflected this hire in the technology support line item. However, if you look at the chart on page 105, Darien is still understaffed relative to our fellow districts. As a department, we are comfortable with only 1 more FTE at this point, since it is coupled with the increase in the repairs budget line. The ability to outsource iPad and Chromebook repairs to the local U-Break iFix store essentially gives us the second FTE and allows us to function efficiently at this point in time. The second line item would be the software maintenance budget, 13035. The software maintenance list begins on page 109. And this software is divided into 4 sections: operational, administrative, instructional, and assessments. For the first section, operational, there are no major additions. For the administrative section, we have 3 additions. One is DocuSign, which allows for paperless signings of contracts and agreements used by multiple administrators and departments. Second is ScreenCloud, which allows us to manage the 20 digital displays that we see throughout the district. And the final and major one is Zoom, the new backbone for our remote and hybrid learning models, as well as BOE meetings. The third section is instructional, and fourth is assessments, and I will turn this over to Dr. McGettigan.
Good afternoon. Thank you again to the board for all your strong support. Truly appreciate it. Obviously, the pandemic has presented many challenges in providing the right software, support, and professional learning to our faculty to provide the best learning environment possible. I'm very proud of our faculty who have mastered a number of technical skills, as well as an understanding of various software applications. When reviewing our instructional software budget, we reduced our software applications to those applications which provide both the optimal learning environment and also demonstrated high usage by both students and teachers. So for example, our book creator app, we expanded from last year, and we have created over 13,000 digital books. On average in our Nearpod, which we have expanded across the district, we have about 3,000 students engaged per month. So we've seen really high usage of these applications. They provided many different types of learning supports for all learners. So we would like to obviously keep all these things, but again, we have tried to cut it down to just the absolute bare necessities. And that's it for me on the academic instructional software.
The next line item we would go to would be the wide area network 64006. This major increase in the wide area network reflects the increase of internet bandwidth from 1 gigabit to 3 gigabit, as well as moving our firewall services to the cloud. This allows us to take advantage of equipment that we would otherwise have to buy. Next line item is 72044, repairs and service contract. We have recommended a budget of nearly $85,000 for repairs due to the increase in devices in the district. Close to 5,500 district devices are now in use simultaneously during remote instruction. This basically covers the cost of sending broken devices to the Darien U-Break iFix store. The final line item is new computer equipment, 123021. The listing for this equipment is on page 112. And I'll go through each one of these items individually. The first is the K2 Chromebook tablets. This line item replaces the last of the Chromebooks that will be at end of life in 2022. These Chromebooks need to be replaced or certain software will not function. We have identified 3 titles that need a minimum Chrome OS version or operating system version to function properly, one of which is Zoom. And if the Chromebook does not update due to the end of life, the software will not work. The second set of items, the grade 5 Chromebook, 9th grade iPads, the 9th grade iPad cases, and iPad crayons. That simply continues our one-to-one initiative. Next item is the elementary and Middlesex switches. This replaces the network backbone switches that are at end of life. Basically, no support exists for these older switches. If one were to fail, the network for a given school could be unavailable for days. The next item is the first grade displays. This continues the replacement of the outdated and unsupported smart boards. The kindergarten and first grade displays were to be replaced last year or were dropped due to budget constraints. The current smart boards do not work well with Zoom and are causing issues with teaching at the K1 level. Being fiscally responsible, we are requesting only for the replacement at the first grade level for next year. Next item is the K5 classroom teacher devices. These computers are 6 years old and need to be replaced. This replacement gives us the opportunity to replace the desktops with possibly another device, such as a Chromebook or a laptop, to help the teaching environment. Finally on the list are the handheld cameras, broadcast project, and library IMAX, which I will let Dr. McGannigan talk about.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Our broadcast studio, we have neglected a bit over the past few years. So we have a lab that is full of computers that have reached their end of life. So we are asking to replace that lab with new computers. We also have several handheld cameras that need to be replaced. We have actually 4 computers in the library that have reached their end of life. So we are asking to replace those 4 PCs with 2 iMacs, which both students and faculty regularly use in the library. So that will bring a total of 6 iMacs in the libraries that are available to students and to faculty.
And that concludes our quick presentation.
Okay, I will open it up to board questions and comments. Mrs. Stein?
Hi, I had a question about the copy center para, where you're saying we're seeing a decline of 20% in copy center use. Is that any of that COVID related? Will we see that spike? In terms of the additional 175 hours, who would be performing that work if we're getting rid of one of the paras? Who's absorbing the work?
So I can answer that. So we did look, so we have a tool called PaperCut, which actually allows us to track usage. And so we looked at the time in which school was fully in session, and then we compared it to the prior years to get the best apples to apples comparison. The usage in the copy center is down about 20% year over year. Obviously, when you look at the days where either hybrid or remote, it's actually much more significant. When we're remote, the copy center is essentially not being used at all. In terms of the hours, we would have that one individual would likely have to work a little bit of overtime, and that's what those hours are factored in for.
You have the staff.
We do.
Sorry, you have the staff to do it.
We do.
Additional board questions and comments. Mr. Maroney?
Yeah, so a question on the wide area network. So currently we're at 1 gig and you're proposing to go to 3 gigs in the fall.
Dennis, could you just make sure you're talking to the microphone
Sorry.
too?
My question is that something we need to ramp up and provide for the spring? I mean, it seems like we're using a lot of we're putting demands on the system. Would it not be smart to do it now than to wait until the fall?
We are currently at 3 gigabit.
Okay.
This reflects the increase in cost.
Mr. Brown?
Hi, thank you. Sorry. Mr. Adams, thank you for everything you've been doing, trying to keep things running through the situation. I just wanted to put out there, this to me is one of those issues that seems to be, we're conflicting budget and we're conflicting policy. And this is what I want to reserve in the libraries. We seem to have a lot of technology work going on with the libraries. We also seem to be continuing with the one-to-one, which I know we've had discussions at the board level as to whether we should continue that, whether it should be relooked at. And so it's difficult for me to, without knowing what our policy is beyond the triage immediate situation of getting something in everyone's hand, what are we actually building towards and how does this support that? So I would welcome an opportunity to hear from the admin and have a discussion at the board as to where we're actually going, because I'm not clear what our policy is at this point on technology.
So we did have a presentation here last year where we talked about the implementation of the one-to-one, and the 9th grade. We had that discussion about, was it iPad or otherwise at the high school level. So that continues the practice that we outlined to the board in the spring of last year, I believe it was, with the 9th grade. And then this just continues the replacement with the 5th grade, and it does include now K to 1 here, because it's ubiquitous at this point. I think the decision reality has been made for us in many ways.
Dr. Alley, I agree. I recall the conversation we had. I seem to recollect we were maybe going to hear more on that. And then obviously with the way events unfolded, we had other things to deal with. So totally understand we haven't addressed it. Without going deep into policy, one-to-one seems pretty outdated at this point after what we've been through in the past year. And I'm not sure why we're continuing that other than we're kicking the can. So I think we've discussed at the board, we'd like more information. I don't think we've had that conversation, and I would just like to invite an opportunity to hear more before we can decide on this.
Okay.
Mrs. Ackman?
So again, I think we have to be careful when we're using the word policy. We don't have a policy regarding one-to-one. That's an instructional technique that the board committed to. I will tell you, as a board member, I don't remember ending that program. I would agree that K through 1, K through 2 is new. So I'd like to see how we see that rollout going forward. How do we see those kids utilizing it? If we're back in school like a normal year, what's the role of that device in the classroom? But outside of that unique group, I don't think we've ever talked about stopping one-to-one. And I also don't think we have a policy regarding one-to-one. So I just think we have to be careful on the terms. Again, there's no policy review on one-to-one. There might be a programmatic review we can do, but we don't have a policy regarding one-to-one.
So I can find it, whether it's policy or program or initiative or however we want to phrase it. I seem to recall there was a conversation, we'd met our objectives of one-to-one, and everyone it had been achieved. So I had the perception and thought, and I believe there was discussion that there would be more forthcoming. We haven't had it, and it's understandable why we haven't, but I'd like to be able to have that before we proceed on the budget, or at least have a better understanding of where we're going.
Are you looking for,
Mrs.
sorry
Stein.
to chime in, are you talking about an updated tech plan? Where we had the 3-year rollout with the iPads, and are you looking for an update to that? Is that what you're referring to? We haven't.
Yeah, we haven't heard anything since last spring. Again, that's understandable. That's completely fine. I just would like to know where we're going at this point, after especially the past year and the new learning experience we've had with technology. I can't imagine where we were last spring is where we are now.
Mr. Sini?
Yeah, and then to piggyback on what both of you said, that increment of K through 2 now seems to be a new cohort that we're going to be using technology. So I think it'd be helpful for us to understand how that is implemented in the quote unquote normal school year.
I think that the question for me is kind of, I think you've all asked it. It's not about the policy. It's about the updated tech plan to one-to-one initiative. So we understand the one-to-one in K1, K2, K through 2, but in a perfect world, we go back to the normal learning environment in September. How is all that equipment being used from a curriculum standpoint? I think that's what I'm not understanding is, it's great. We have a snow day, we have a hurricane, or, people are able to do remote learning, which is needed. But when we go back to the classroom, all this equipment, how is it going to be used day in and day out, tied in with the curriculum? That's one of the things that comes into my mind. Mrs. McCammon.
The other piece of that where I think we left off was there were some questions about usage and whether or not some of our students were actually using the devices they were issued. And I understand that can be challenging to track, but to the extent that we can make a decision about whether or not we are committing to providing the devices as we would a textbook, or whether it's more like football helmets, where if you need a device, we're happy to provide it, but if you prefer to use a device of your choice, which again would be a full-scale programmatic change, and there are complexities to that. But if we have kids fundamentally not using the devices, I think I'm not proposing a change. I just want to make sure that we remember to touch on it since it came up last year.
Mr. Adams, I would ask also just at a high level, something like Zoom at $24,000. We need it. We're doing it right now. We go back to a normalized school year. Do we need that level of Zoom, or and do we scale it back, knowing we can always scale it up if needed again? And that's just for a lot of this technology. Is that a logical question? I don't even know.
Yes, we need it.
Yeah, a lot of these subscriptions are 1-year basis.
Okay.
So unfortunately, yeah, you would have to buy it for the year, but then scale down or up after the year.
But this current year, we might need platinum Zoom, but in a normal school year, maybe we need gold Zoom. Right?
Correct.
Okay.
Alan, maybe, sorry.
I'll go to Mrs. Achman. She had her hand up.
So I think we have to go back to where we were, because we do have as we're talking about it, we have the public watching. Mrs. McCammon is correct. Late in budget season, it was raised last year that do kids use their own devices? And anecdotally, we are hearing, yes, they do. And there was a question of, can you track that? But my recollection, and I'm happy if board members have a different one, is we never questioned whether we were continuing or not with the one-to-one program. And so that what's in this budget, the 9th grade iPads and the 5th grade replacement iPads are normal, expected, rolling forward costs that we expected to see. We've talked ad nauseum with the Board of Finance about the RTM, that's kind of our ongoing cost for one-to-one. I think Mr. Sini and Mrs. Stein and I are saying K through 2 is new. So we'd like to hear a little bit more about what that looks like in the future. But I don't know, or at least I've never heard, either as chair or as a sitting member, that we are looking to stop one-to-one. And I think if we're going to have that conversation, that's a major shift. And when the administration prepared this budget, they never envisioned us doing that. So if that's the board's intention, then we should have it today and we should know that. Because I don't know how we move forward with rolling costs if we don't tell the administration, oh, all of a sudden we're changing our mind on a rollout that's been going on.
My view is there's no change in the one-to-one rollout. It's understanding the K through 2 rollout and understanding how it works with the curriculum.
That's where I am.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So sort of along those same lines, where do we stand right now with devices for the elementary, specifically the K1, who we're looking to purchase for? I guess it's there's a lot of devices that we're looking to purchase. Do we not have devices that can be used next year for those students? And these all have to be replaced at the same time? Can we look at this number again and maybe replace some of them? Because it seems like a pretty big nut at one time. And the other thing I wanted to request that you take a look at is just how many devices you're using compared to enrollment. For instance, I look at the 9th grade iPads, and enrollment for 9th grade next year is 379 students, and we're purchasing 415, giving us 36 extra. So is that what you need in extra? Can we look at that a little bit closer? And then also the desktops for the teachers. What I'm seeing in the budget is $915 per unit. The number seems a little bit high based on, I just did some quick math, how many actual elementary teachers we will have next year based on the sections, which I calculate as 114. So maybe just take a closer look at that. And if we're considering a lower cost device, can we also know what that cost would be? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ritchie. Additional questions from the board? Mrs. McCammon.
I have two statements and a question. So the first is, I do agree from a budgetary perspective, just philosophically, we budget according to where we are. I think that what I'm talking about in terms of usage and some of the other folks have, talked about, kind of like the bus or other stuff where we need to talk about outside of the budget process and just earmarking it today. I am glad, Jeff, to hear you talking about looking at whether or not we use desktops or not for the elementary school teachers. I think it's wise, particularly since they're popping in and out of environments. And while they may not be with the same frequency, I think it provides a flexibility, and I'm glad we're looking at that. My question is, I know last year we talked about the possibility of looking at Aspen, and I think that there was a budget for that, as I recall. So I just wanted to know where that initiative is or isn't today. I don't see it in the budget.
It's currently not in the budget.
Any additional, Mrs. Ritchie?
So this is sort of the point I made with health, and I'm going to make it with the subscriptions that we have for software, because some of these subscriptions we're seeing could potentially be an ongoing cost to the district that are related to COVID. So I guess I'm getting mired in detail, but we're including these things because we see them as operationally necessary. So I want to make sure that anything that's operationally necessary going forward as a result of COVID is included in the budget, because that's what we should be asking for. What we foresee as a permanent expense to the district, whether or not it's related to COVID. Thanks.
Mr. Sini.
I was just going to ask Alan to comment, because when Zoom was brought up, Alan, you like vigorously shook your head yes and said, oh yeah. So could you give us a little more in the non-COVID environment? What value is it delivering the district?
Well, it's one of the things I think Mr. Cannon asked about. What are the new learnings? That's a new learning for us in terms of why everybody could do video conferencing to some degree, right? It wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now, and there's efficiencies being realized in the district. There's new ways of doing things with teams. I just couldn't imagine not functioning with that piece of software anymore, or a piece of software such as that provide that opportunity, because that is now being built into the way we do business, and in teaching and learning. So, which we'll continue to talk about, but it's just the way we're going to be operating moving forward.
Thank you.
Any additional questions or comments from the board? Mrs. McCammon, I make my head.
Yeah, fair enough. The word funny spot. Thank you. And I asked this unfortunately on the last RC, but Jeff, you talked a little bit about it, but would you please talk about staffing in your department a little more color? How we have touched on it, but the impact of the new staff member, how that's supported you, what you're anticipating going into next year, and just the soft side of what staffing looks like for you all, given we see the numbers here.
Sure, sure. It's been a tremendous help to the department. Where we were lacking was at the elementary level. So once we went remote or hybrid, we issued devices to each and every elementary student. So then the device count went from 1,300 to about 2,100. And we only have one staff member dedicated to the elementary level. With the hiring of the second staff member, it has alleviated all of the pressure off of our department. And we're able to provide timely support for not only the students, but the parents as well. These guys, my team's on the phone all day with families, and having this new staff member has been a tremendous help.
Thank you.
So Jeff, I thank you for that. I would follow up on that and say, well, I appreciate, and I'm sure the rest of the board does, constantly looking at and presenting us with the right budget. But I also think we don't know what we don't know starting in September. Hopefully it's better. But I would make sure we think through what we actually need. Because I think if you look at the feedback from parents, you listen to students, I want to make sure they all feel they're getting the response time they need in terms of having technology issues, sign-on issues, getting online, systems going down. If it's not enough, we need to understand that, because if we go back into the remote scenario, or next year in the new school year it starts, we've got to have the right support and infrastructure in place, because it just sets the wrong tone for the day, for the student, for the parent, the pressure that's on them with remote learning. So I appreciate us trying to watch the budget dollars, but when it comes to support for this technology and making sure the parents and the students have access in timely responses, let's make sure we think through that fully. Any other board questions or comments? Mrs. Ritchie?
I'm sorry, Jeff. I just wanted, you mentioned something and I jotted it down, but I want to make sure I got it right. So we have 5,500 devices being used in the district. Is that simultaneously? You said something, I think, along those lines. Is that correct?
Give or take. If we're in a remote environment, yes. If every student is on, plus all of the staff and administrative computers, the number hovers around 5,500.
Okay, thank you. And just a quick thank you for everything you and all of your staff are doing, because really it's been amazing how you've been able to pivot and adapt. And so I just wanted to give you a quick thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, I think a lot of us echo that. Thanks, Jeff. Mrs. Achman.
So I'm going to make an argument or a case maybe for something I've argued against for years. I need more information, but earlier in the day, Mr. Davis said that there may be a change to how capital is viewed in the town and projects $100,000 or over. And again, I know we've talked about useful lifespans of computers and does that hit a capital request? But if we are now buying K through 12 at some point, or we have reoccurring costs K through 12 in excess of $100,000, it may be valuable to talk to Mr. Davis and whatever information he has, even for next year, and seeing, does this fit the new definition of capital? So just tickler, even though for years I have argued computers are not capital, with a new definition they might be.
Yeah, it's a good point. I can almost see Mr. Davis shaking his head on the Zoom call. So, any other board questions or comments before we open it up to committees, to other boards? All right, Michelle.
Committee members, please raise your hands at this time if you have any questions. We'll start with Mr. Jack Davis. You are unmuted and recognized.
First, let me answer the question that was just raised by Ms. Achman. It's a total project that's $100,000, and the appropriate group to talk to would be the Board of Finance, not me. But for computers, the standard item would have to cost $5,000 and have a useful life of at least 2 to 3 years. So since the actual iPads don't cost $5,000 each, I do not believe that at least those would be able to be accrued for. I do want to go and say that I really like the schedule that's on page 113. I think it's extremely helpful. But I might ask if we can have the 5th year there, because I think that would provide the replacement life of what we're looking in the cycle. And then for the Darien High School broadcast studio, I'm just wondering if we have explored any outside grants that might help us fund that. So those are our questions. Thank you very much. Very good presentation.
Sorry,
Thank you, Jack.
Can I interrupt? Jack reminded me of a question I had that.
Yes,
we were
Mrs.
still
Achman has a
on
question.
computers.
Mrs. Stein.
Sorry, just, Dr. McGettigan, can we just, to Jack's point on the broadcast studio, we used to have Blue Wave News. That is no longer in existence, correct?
No, it is in existence. Again, you know, the lab has kind of fallen upon neglect, and it used to be an extremely vital part of the high school. So it's been reduced to a club. But again, if all things happen as requested, we will actually bring media studies back into the technology fold and be better able to run just strictly production classes, which will be really valuable for our students. It's something that they are interested in addition to down the road film classes, which would be great. And it is our hope to open up the broadcast studios to the high school, so it's part of that reimagined library space. So all in all, I think that this is as Mr. Davis says, there's certainly grants out there that we will be seeking in terms of replacing the actual studio equipment. There's really not too much grants out there in terms of replacing the computer labs themselves, but the studio equipment certainly. Did I answer everything?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Stein. Thank you, Mrs. McGettigan. Michelle?
Taylor Carter, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thanks. I appreciate all the board's questions. I'll just reiterate, as a Board of Finance member, I'd also like to see how curriculum for K through 2 will line up with the need for that many Chromebook replacements. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Mrs. Taylor.
Julie Best, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. I had a question regarding the Chromebook tablets. Would love to understand what the difference is between a Chromebook tablet and a regular Chromebook. I think it says that a tablet is age appropriate for K-2, so would like to know a little more about that. And I had an observation which struck me in this discussion more than any others earlier today, just that a post-COVID world, we need to remember we can't assume it's the same as a pre-COVID world, which is kind of obvious, but it really, I felt like that was a lot of what was being discussed here. So I thought I would share it. And lastly, we wanted to offer a big thank you to Mr. Adams and his team for all of their hard work and support. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Beck.
Teresa Vogt, you are unmuted and recognized.
Sorry about that. Let me just find the question again. Okay, from one of our members. Why such a modest number? Hi, can you hear me? Oh, Clara, do you want to ask it?
No, you asked it. I have two others, but I wasn't being recognized,
Okay.
for the past couple of times. So this question.
No, we're recognizing committees, Clara. So Michelle understands who's raising their hand.
Go
So
ahead.
raise their hand. Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Teresa.
Oh, okay. So it's just one of our committee members. Why such a modest number request for help on the desk maintenance, especially if there's a request for more software maintenance? Clara, I don't have the other questions, so you can go.
Okay, so I understand that the selectmen are requesting a tech report from Bloom Shapiro, and I wondered if this would have any budget implications for the Board of Ed. And also, I agree with Mr. Davis. I wrote down, try to ask for a grant for the money for the broadcast studio or for any other technology expenses. Perhaps you could get some help.
Clara,
Thank you.
Clara, could you just ask your question again around what the Selectman Office is doing or looking for?
Okay, I was told that the selectmen are doing a Bloom Shapiro tech report, a request for consulting, and I wondered if there, as the outcome of that report, might there be budget implications for the Board of Ed, perhaps a recommendation for OpenGov or some other things that they may find that would be necessary.
Yes, my
Did you get that?
understanding is that that was an audit on the town side, and we have that audit to review and for potential discussions with the First Selectman's office.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Ackman?
Sorry, I think, and we're hearing this question about outside funding, which I think we should always look at, but this was part of media studies, which was curriculum based. It's kind of sad to hear, although many of us suspected that media studies had died out a bit. So I think we just need to be mindful if we're buying equipment, which people have done for labs and stuff like that, but we also need to be mindful that we fund curriculum. And last I heard, media studies is still curriculum based. So we just need to be mindful as we move forward of the intersection of those two things.
Thank you, Mrs. Ackman. Any other?
Yes, Courtney Darby, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, too, I think that the way media studies worked is it became a prerequisite for the video production courses. And I will say, I think it's so important for so many kids who really want to learn that technical skill to let them go ahead and learn that skill maybe and not have a prerequisite. I still think the media studies course is fantastic, and I'm not knocking that in any way, shape, or form. But I would really love for that to be more of a discussion, especially in the kind of current world that we're in. Thanks.
Thanks, Mrs. Darby.
Duke, sorry.
Mr. Sini.
This media studies brought up maybe an issue that we're facing with a private group that might have siphoned off some of the interest within the district. So I guess the question of the administration is that the effect, meaning Darren Athletic Foundation Media has been, as I understand it, had their own media production crew. And I'm just wondering if siphoned off is the wrong word, I guess, but redirected the students' interest there versus our own internal program. So it'd be interesting to hear the administration's view on that.
I would honestly would be speculating on that, John. I would have to
Yeah, no,
review
we'll
this.
come back.
So what John is accurate. And when the board kind of approved in a weird way, DAF media, which has been fantastic for our schools coming in, that was one of the concerns and questions. What would happen to media studies? Were you pulling it apart? And there was really a concern that, like, were we losing curriculum-based opportunities for students in school who might not want to join an outside club for whatever reason? So taking nothing away from DAF Media, which has done an amazing job, and quite frankly, I thank them for all their coverage of our fall sports, which was amazing. That was always a concern. Are we losing the curriculum-based component in school? And it seems like, again, that intersection needs to be looked at.
Yeah, or I would just put it as students' interest outside of school might have been redirected in their need to, but.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, good. Thank you both.
There are no more committee questions at this time.
We will open it up for any public comment on RC 22 technology, RC 15 technology.
There are no raised hands from the public at this time.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you all for the questions and the comments and the dialogue. We will move on to RC 26, the early learning program.
Right,
Hello.
Mrs. Straight. Right, we are. All right. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for hearing the proposed budget for the RC 26 Early Learning Program 21-22. Just as a reminder, ELP is the integrated preschool program where peer models learn alongside children with special needs. Just the current update, ELP numbers are 68. We have 2 students who just moved into town and will be joining the program in January. We'll see an increase of students attending ELP From late winter to spring, the lottery has been done, and we have a total of 48 people who applied and got into the program. We are keeping the application process open to receive more students for the next school year. The overview. The early learning programs, special class teachers and teacher aides, there's a slight increase due to salaries and contract obligations for insurance. Also, I just want to point out that last year, the close in March, we were going to be hiring our full staff that was budgeted for the paraprofessionals, but did not happen because we did close until the start of school year. So the increase is also reflected in that with the staff we did hire. Let's see. Operating budget, the big request to be continued is our work with Dr. Margie Gillis and Literacy How that began in 2019. That year we received a grant from the state of Connecticut's Early Learning Childhood Office. The work focused on initial trainings in early identification and risk factors for dyslexia and reading intervention. This school year, the 2021, will focus on implementation of those strategies and interventions through the coaching model with Margie Gillis and Literacy How. And we would like to continue the work in the 21-22 school year to focus on the implementation and interventions using the continued coaching model. In addition, the account funds curriculum work and the early learning and development standards, and also the preschool assessment, which is the Connecticut Documentation and Observation for Teaching Systems. It's called the CT DOTS. And you can see that there's a 2.5 proposed increase for tuition for next school year from $6,850 to $7,020. So that is the proposed budget moving forward in the 21-22 school year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Straighten. Could I just clarify, you said current 68 students in the program and 48 have applied and been accepted. So there will be 116 people in the program? I think you're muted.
So we will have a graduating class this school year who will go on to kindergarten. So that leaves students from 3 to 4, 4 to 5. So right now, based on our current numbers of 68 and the kids graduating, we would look to have, if everyone accepts the positions or the slots in ELP, we would start with 85 students, not the 100.
Great, thank you. I will open it up to any other board questions or comments. Mr. Sini?
I'm sorry, I lost all those numbers, so I'm not sure if everybody else is. So I guess my question would be, what do we have this year? And then what's the outlook for next year driving the budget? And I know they grow over the school year also. And so I guess this year, how do we come out with what's this year? And how is that versus budgeted? And then what are we looking at next year? If we can put it that way.
So in March, we had 72, March 2020, we had 72 students, just to give you a relative number. This year, January, 8th, 9th, we have 68 students attending. 2 families just moved in from New York and will be joining the program. So that'll bring us up to 70 for the February 1st count. So I think we're on track from last year's tuition to this year's tuition, either being children with IEPs or children who pay tuition. So we have, we have 37 students returning to ELP for the following school year, who are 3 turning 4. And we currently have accepted 48 children through the lottery. Now, we are still in process, so some of these families who have applied may or may not take the early learning program for their preschool year, next school year. But that is in process.
And that's how you came up with the 85.
Yes.
Makes sense, John?
So those numbers will grow or go down, just
Yeah.
depending on
Yeah.
the kids we get from now until June.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Ritchie?
Just building on that, thank you. For this school year, how many more students do you anticipate? We'll be at 70 when the 2 new students come in. Do you at this point know what other additional students may be coming in?
So those 2 students moved in because they moved, from New York to Connecticut. We go through the Birth to 3 system or the community preschool referrals to find children who require special education services. So those numbers are variable because we can't predetermine needs. We have to go through the PPT process to determine if they're eligible for the program. I do not have, at this moment in time, a number. I mean, there's a range, we can say, between 4 and 8 students. But I don't have exact numbers because we would have to go through that PPT process.
Thank you. Mrs. Parent?
Thank you. So this question is asked annually. Is the tuition increase of 2.5 in line with other preschools in the area?
I'll say globally, yes.
Mr. Sini?
So then the question is, if we're going from 70 students to 85, what was budgeted for the 19 and 20 fiscal school year? Were we budgeted at 85?
90.
90? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sini. Any additional questions or comments, Mrs. McCammon?
Laura, when we get a number of acceptances, is there a certain percentage who typically decline, 10% typically say no, 20%? And what I'm going with that is, do we have any concerns about next year's enrollment? And then from there, again, given that we're trying to all preschools will be trying to rebuild a little bit, do we want to think about whether or not this is a year to raise tuition?
So I do think we'll have enough typicals to keep that 50-50 blend for next school year. This school year is, I'll say, last year and this year, because of COVID reasons, the March shutdown through the summer, families have been hesitant to enroll their children in preschool for fear of remote learning for young 3s and 4s. The classrooms are smaller, but that has allowed for our teachers to teach Monday through Thursday during the hybrid periods of the district, if that should happen again. So I do think we are okay with the amount of typicals that are applying, but some of the typicals that do apply do end up going through that referral process. So, the lottery or the way we accept children is still open. I haven't closed that so that we can continue to build our good balance of classrooms. Did I answer your question?
Well, the last piece of it was whether or not that level of confidence extends to whether or not you want to hold a tuition increase for a year to just make sure you can rebuild.
The tuition is always been a kind of a district conversation with the Board of Ed. I will say that it's in line with what the other community preschools are doing. I don't really have.
Thank you, Mrs.
an
Ritchie.
answer for that part.
I'll just echo Jill's comment about the tuition increase, and just as we move ahead, we want to make sure our program continues, and if that becomes an issue, please let us know. Is there a deadline for the parents that have gotten in via the lottery? Is there a deadline for them to accept, and when is that?
Sure. So the first round, let's say the application kind of closed on Friday. I collected all that information, notified parents of you've been accepted for the 21-22 school year. January 15th, we're supposed to know if they're actually accepting those positions or those slots for next school year. The tuition deposit is due mid-February. So hopefully by the end of January, we'll know how many students have currently applied and accepted the position. I'll say, Jill, I did remember like last school year, there was about 15 students who applied that ended up either not accepting for a variety of reasons. One, they moved out of town. Two, they were worried about COVID, or three, they chose a different community preschool for various reasons.
Thank you. Any additional board questions or comments? Mr. Sini?
I just want to echo the comments on the tuition increase, because I don't want to fall short on students. You know, I'm looking at this purely from a revenue standpoint, and I know it's tiny in the budget, but you know, this is one of the questions we've had during the year also, like, is the shortfall on revenue a COVID related expense or not? And kind of in that fuzzy gray area where, you know, we can't, but I think I echo those sentiments. Let's be careful on the tuition, at least, you know, in the next budget year.
So I'd ask that you keep us posted, Mrs. Strayton, if that becomes part of the conversation as people go through accepting.
Sure, I will. Thank you.
Mrs. Ackman?
So we have this tuition conversation every year. And I think what we've established is the district picks up an exorbitant, and the exorbitant doesn't relate to students. It does, I should say, the majority of costs related of this program. The revenue that is paid does not pay for the program. So I think we just need to be careful when we talk about reducing tuition to keep the program going. The district funds this program. So the revenue helps to fund this program, but it's not as if our typical programs, our typical children are assuming the cost for our otherwise developing children. So it's not an apples to apples is all I'd say.
Mrs. Strayton, also there are avenues or venues where people talk to you about what they can afford to pay, or other venues where we can help with payment or how they pay, correct?
Correct. If your family is eligible or for free or reduced lunch, they have a reduced tuition based on those indicators. Also, the district can talk to families if they need a different payment option. But,
Right. So we have those options for those conversations.
it's
Mr.
more
Dean?
the exception
Yeah.
To the rule.
Yeah, thank you.
And again, I don't mean to focus on the revenues, but I understand it. What would be the maximum number of students that we could accommodate under this existing budget, right? I realize it's a cost center, not a revenue center, but it's more impactful by not filling the seats up until that expense. So can we fill up to 90 seats under this budget?
Under this budget, 90.
Right. So the incremental child to get to that 90, you know, the incremental cost associated with a child isn't one-to-one. I mean, you have this fixed cost element up to 90. So if you fall short at 80 just because of tuition, it actually hurts the district more than not filling those seats. That's kind of the thought process I had going through.
True, I would just want to see it proved out that it is tuition that's not filling those seats.
Well, of course.
Eventually we'll have capacity for many more when Oxford comes online. All right, any additional questions or comments from the board? Michelle?
Committee members, please raise your hands at this time if you have any questions. We'll start with Mr. Jack Davis. You are unmuted and recognized.
Laura, nice to see you again in our annual budget.
Thank you, Jack.
I do want to, when you go back to the board, I do think that one of the things that the advantage of your program is the number of days, the number of hours, and the staff that's in your program versus other private programs. So I think that's a very valuable aspect to it. I'll also say, having a number of grandchildren who are out of district, my kids wish they were paying this price. So that's our questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Julie Best, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. It looks like the PD in the budget for this year refers only to identifying dyslexia and reading interventions. So the question is, what other PD is being offered to identify other learning differences? Thanks.
Thank
Sure.
you. Laura, we're going to take questions and we'll do the follow-up. Thank you.
Taylor Carter, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thanks.
Looks like
You're
Taylor.
muted. I guess I'm muted again. Sorry. I don't know what you heard, but as I could see the popularity of this program possibly going up as a result of, current events, COVID and whatever, although that may be temporary and they're such young kids. How many students can we accommodate in the new Oxbridge facility?
100 and the spec is for 150.
Wow, cool. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Jamie Zionic, you are unmuted.
Sorry, Duke, I couldn't hear you. 150 or 115?
150, 150.
Jamie Zionic, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. I agree with Julie, but we do support the continued work with Margie Gillis. We'd also, we suggested this last year, but I think it would be helpful to see the expenses for ELP coming from this RC instead of RC 24. And that goes along the line of the discussion I think that you've been having. Additionally, I'm curious if the transition of the SES facilitators that's proposed to assistant principals will also impact ELP. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Zionic.
There are no more raised hands from the committee members.
Mrs. Sartori or Mrs. Vogt, anything from you?
No, nothing from us.
No.
Thank you. I will open it up to general public comments or questions.
There are no raised hands at this time.
Thank you all. Mr. Sini?
Can this be part of that open schools program? ELP?
Open choice.
Open choice, I'm sorry.
The question is ELP part of the open choice program?
Could it be?
I would have to check for this region, for the greater Hartford region. It is. That tends to be a very personal decision in terms of, putting that age of a student on a bus, but they do it in car seats and so on and so forth. I wouldn't suggest starting there, even if that's the case, but I can certainly explore that. I'm not sure in the areas around here if the ELP is actually being explored by other districts. I would have to check, but
okay, that'd be great.
But I know they haven't ruled it out in other areas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sini. We will move on to RC 24, special education.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Have a good rest of your day.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Mrs. Fine.
Hi, how are you? Good afternoon, members of the Board of Education, the Darien school community, and colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity and for your continued support for our students, faculty-related service providers, and paraprofessionals in the Special Education and Student Services Department. I thank you for the opportunity this afternoon to present the RC 24 special education budget. And if I may begin with our request for 5 additional assistant principals in our elementary schools. The elementary school principals, special education program directors, Christopher Trambrick and me, have thoughtfully reviewed the current special education student services facilitators' position responsibilities. They include supporting the maintenance and improvement of regulatory compliance, support the implementation of settings and services, support the improvement of student outcomes, and strengthen the engagement of students and families as partners. And as exceptional as our SES facilitators have performed their responsibilities, they do not have the authority to supervise, evaluate, and ensure staff accountability and implementation. And if I may just present some of the opportunities that the APs will have that the current SES facilitators do not have. They will, of course, be responsible for maintaining all the SES responsibilities that include monitoring compliance, making sure and ensuring positive and supportive relationships with families and the community, providing consultation to families, ongoing consultation with teachers. And if you notice, the language in the job responsibilities are participate, collaborate, but they don't have the opportunity to enforce. The value added opportunity for assistant principals will really support improvement of student outcomes. And the opportunity for that is that they have the authority to observe, to evaluate, and to provide actionable feedback to teachers and related service providers. They also have the opportunity to evaluate with multiple lenses. The assistant principal will have expertise in specially designed instruction as well as general education. The expertise in SDI methodologies and how to really improve teaching and learning in all of our programs. Supporting special educators and related service providers, supporting general education and special education area teachers, supporting paraprofessionals, and building capacity. And the distinction between current SES facilitators and assistant principals is, as an administrator, they will be doing evaluations. They'll be giving that authentic feedback. They'll be helping to improve instruction in the classroom. They'll be working both in the general education classroom and really supporting accommodations and modifications and what differentiation can look like, and giving that authentic feedback to all of the teachers. That's the distinction of why we're requesting it. We also know in terms of fostering compliance, that will have the same value and merit that it currently has. That is an essential part of why the design was firstly enacted. And that was really to ensure compliance with IDEA and with the PPT process. I've asked Julie Droller, our principal at Hinley, to join me during this part of the presentation to really talk. She had the opportunity to work in her former district in Westport, where they had this model with an assistant principal supporting special education. I've asked Julie to really look at how it enhanced building administration, how it fostered collaboration, and how the monitoring and the accountability really supported the goals of what this role will provide. And Julie, and I think all the elementary principals are with us, but Julie, can I call on you to join in those two areas?
Yes, yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for this opportunity. I found it to be so beneficial to have that second assistant principal with the lens of somebody with an expertise in specially designed instruction. It enhanced the knowledge base of our whole instructional leadership team. Really, it assisted in staff recruitment. It assisted in monitoring and evaluating student progress. And as Shirley said, the collaboration between regular and special education teachers was a huge benefit. There was consistent knowledge of grade level content and instructional practices that we could bring to PLCs. And I'll just explain our structure. There are 6 grade levels in an elementary school K through 5. And so typically the principal and the 2 assistant principals would divide that up and take 2 grade levels, as well as supervise and evaluate the special education support staff and special area teachers, and we rotate. We would calibrate and do learning walks together to talk about what we were seeing. So having that lens really helped with consistent knowledge and application of accommodations and modifications, generalization of skills applied in the general ed classroom. It benefited not only the administrative team, but the general ed teachers, as well as the special education team. And another advantage in terms of streamlining response time to families, having that person who oversees the special education as an administrator, it saves that extra step from having to find out an answer or not having the authority to make decisions. In terms of connection to parents, we still all would be involved in meetings and those parent relationships, because that is so important in any building. So that's not something that we would give up and just delegate to this person. We would still all do that as well. So I think that those were really the major things that I wanted to address.
Thank you, Julie. I wanted to, before I open up to questions, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. It wasn't on my screen, thank you. Before I open it to questions, I did want to say that I think when they first designed the SES facilitator, I think there was a different climate. I think there were different areas that were looking at it, and the emphasis was really on facilitation and compliance. I think we have certainly over the last 5 years, I can speak to, in year 6, we have really addressed that, and we have our systems in place. I think we want to go beyond that, and we're not looking for additional FTEs. We're really looking to, and between the delta of what we currently have, of really looking at now improving student outcomes, looking how we can take the expertise beyond the PPT process. And I don't want to minimize that the current building administrators, and I did that in our narrative in the budget book, spent an average of 355 hours. That was last year in a year at meeting attendance. It would certainly also give the opportunity to all the administrators to have more time inside classrooms and with teaching and learning. But I do want to really emphasize that the needs really now are really to take it from the PPT process into the classroom and to make sure that we have accountability, that we're able to really measure student outcomes, that we're ready to give authentic feedback and make sure that we have that SDI piece going from developing goals and objectives to implementation in the classroom. And that's why we're asking for the opportunity to have assistant principals to support that initiative. I'll be glad to take any questions and thank you.
Mrs. Klein, I think we're going to keep, in order to stay kind of consistent, we'll continue with the overall RC presentation and then open it up to questions. And I know we'll be back to this specific topic quickly.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
I'll go on to after that in the budget book also, if we look at the different lines in consultant services, we're asking for an increase. And again, the consultation, assistive technology, social skill programs, the consultant services that we utilize for all of our programs, we really know that due to school closure, that we've sort of changed delivery models, it just not only because of cohorts, but very often it will be that a child was in a 3-to-1 group and now we need to do a 1-to-1 group. We also know that there's some recovery as we go through PPTs and really evaluate how students are doing. That's when we make those determinations if we need to revisit their goals and objectives, if we need to look at frequency and duration of services. And so we have asked for an increase in that line for consultant services. The same is true for contracted speech. We've looked at the current IEP recommendations, knowing things will change between now and the end of the school year as well. But again, looking at based on the pandemic, based on school closure, and looking at those PPT decision-making that we know that we'll have to, and we already have increased service and delivery for speech and language as well. OT, actually, we're asking for, basically there's a reduction on the OT line. That again is based on some students aging out or articulation. So there is just a decrease on that line. For physical therapy, we've also asked again based, there's a decrease looking at the proposed budget, and that really again is based on PPT decisions and recommendations, as well as some aging out or students who have exited special education. For computers, software, and supplies, and you can see in our narrative that we have, we've really increased our narrative and opportunities for students to really utilize computer software and supplies. Probably was a result of the need when we went into remote learning, but we would like to maintain that and the technologies that support our students. For transportation, and I know Rich had spoken earlier to this also, but we are recommending a third Suburban as well, which would allow us to reduce some costs in transportation for this year. And at the same time, again, our ESY services, and Rich could speak to this also later, we did not have transportation this summer. So we will be increasing, you'll see that in our budget line item increased, because hopefully we'll be in person this coming summer. For our account for out-of-district special education transport, you can also say the reduction on that line. For tuition public schools, you can see there was a reduction on that line as well, and that's based on IEP decisions and PPTs for student programs and recommendations. On the tuition non-public, you'll see that there is a slight increase on that, again, based on PPT recommendations and also unilateral parent placement. For excess cost, again, we give the description and the identification every year of how that excess cost line is determined by the state. And later on, you can see in the budget book, if you look on page 149, for those who have the book there, you can see how the reimbursement schedule has been over the last several years and what rate we're at for the coming year. And those are our line items. The only thing I'd like to add to that also, when you're also looking at it, is page 147 in your books. You'll see that in the areas of special class teachers, speech therapists, there's an increase. Those increases are based on collective bargaining agreement. ESY, you'll see that's also contractual, and there'll be an extra 2 days this year. In June, our psychologist line that shows an increase of 3.36 also is based on collective bargaining and salaries. Teacher aides and contractual as well. And the transportation I spoke to, and Alicia spoke earlier about the nurses for that 0.2 increase as well. Pupil evaluation, I did want to say also the increase on that, as you can see, is based on that we did not have a lot of evaluations last year. And if you look at the actual proposed and what was actually expended, based of course on school closure, we are anticipating that we will resume that and have our students and opportunities for increased evaluations. And those are the items I wanted to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Klein. Appreciate that and all the work of you and your team. I will open it up to board questions and comments. Mrs. Stein.
Hi, Shirley. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll start with one and let my fellow board members go. With the SESS as APs, currently the SESS facilitators report directly to you. Can you talk a little bit about the reporting structure once they become assistant principals? I assume they'll report to their building principal, but what will your role be with them?
So they will report to the building principal. That is the intention. They will, and I will work collaboratively as I do now with the building principals and with the program directors to support the APs in the buildings.
Additional questions are on Mrs. Parent.
Thank you, Shirley. I would just like to request that there is a more delineation about what this AP role would be versus the current AP versus the principal, just what everybody would be doing. And I like to hear that Julie's experience in Westport. I'm just curious if other districts in our DIRG have a similar setup.
And Julie did speak. I will say that I did reach out to Westport, to Mike Rizzo recently, because I wanted to see the design, and still does continue. So that's the information I do have. The design, again, is what Julie described in Westport in terms of the model. There will be the division of time at PPTs, though, that it doesn't take away from the principals or the other assistant principal, but there is more time spent with this assistant principal, of course, at PPTs. That was the one division. So if you looked at a percentage of time, looking at that, there was certainly a greater percentage of time that's at the PPTs for this AP than the principal and the other AP. They both said, though, Julie and Mike as well, that there are certain families already in relationships, and moving forward, that principals and the other AP will be the people who are chairing those meetings. So it did not compromise that process. I also did want to say I had a chance to speak to parents who were parents of students in Westport at that time. When they went to a meeting or in the building, they didn't know who the assistant principal was, whether it was a special education assistant principal who was spending more time there or the other AP. There was no designation, and they were not aware of who the other AP was. Julie, did you want to add to that?
The only thing that there were two things that I was thinking about. The connection between SRBI and special education was also something that was really beneficial. because we did have meetings where we talked about all kids all the time. And so it was a very smooth transition. And again, that cohesion, a lot of the same instructional strategies, very smooth when kids moved in and out. You know, the biggest impact is really that the SES facilitator as a colleague can make suggestions about teaching and learning, but as an administrator, they really have the authority to provide support, such as provide release time to teachers, or you know, plan professional development with them. So there's really like more of an authority and an accountability, as Mrs. Klein said.
Mrs. McCammon.
Some number of years ago, when we put the assistant principals in, my understanding was, I guess it's about 10 years ago, that one of the big drivers was that they would be able to administer PPTs. Moving forward a few years, when we put the facilitators in, one of the main arguments was that those assistant principals didn't at the time have the right expertise to make all of the PPT decisions, and that we needed to bring in some additional special education expertise into the buildings to support that. Or otherwise, we would have had to do an extensive amount of professional development. So what I would like to understand is, with this role, if there is a level of training or additional expertise that is required over and above an administrative degree. And one, and then two, will they run separate caseloads? Because if there is additional expertise that is required, unlike the psychologists who just share typically chronologically, are you handling the population separately based on, you know, it's a principal of special ed versus a vice principal of special ed versus a vice principal general ed? Thank you.
I can take the first part. The part of the administrative training, the notion of Ms. McCannigan is that we would hire the assistant principal, and this would be a posted position, looking for someone with the expertise to have already the knowledge of how to be able to have all four of those areas that we want implemented in their wheel set. So that would be the first part. The distribution, we know that there'd be the majority of PPT attendance would be with this person who has these expertise, so it can be translated into the classroom as well. And how in each building, and I'll let the principal speak to that in terms of their supervision and evaluation, they would maintain what the different attendance they would at PPTs based on their relationships with families and new families coming in as well. So I'm not quite sure if that answers the part, but the idea is that they would look at the PPTs. The majority would go to the new assistant principal with those expertise. And the balance would also be among the other administrators in the building, which would be the other AP and the principal. But I don't see that there'd be a need for any additional training, because the current principals and assistant principals have participated over, and I know you said 10 years, I can only speak to the 6 years to my experience, have been at those meetings, have developed and already have those skills as well, and have participated as instructional leaders in their building for all students, whether they're in general education or special education.
Mrs. Achman.
So building off of Mrs. McCammon's question, and maybe flipping it just a little bit, is there a way for us to capture currently how often in a PPT we have an administrator who must be there by law and a SES facilitator? Because what I'm wondering is, while we see this as an addition to this budget, is there a redundancy there in the amount of staffing and time we have? Whereas we could maybe distribute staff differently and they could be getting other jobs done. So it's a little bit of Mrs. Parent's question, job descriptions, and Mrs. McCammon, sorry, flipping a little bit of what you're saying, Mrs. McCammon, but saying how often in the PPT do we have the experience of a SES facilitator plus the legally obliged administrator, and is that really a good fiscal model? As well as whatever the best model is for a student. That's what I'm saying. Like I'm looking at Mrs. McCammon's question and then building upon it.
Okay. So, and thank you. In our budget narrative, we explained that both are always present at elementary school. So there is always an administrator and a SES facilitator in all our PPTs, PPT 1 and PPT 2 on the elementary level, which is why we said there is a redundancy and both people are present, and it isn't a good use of our resources. And the reason for decision making, and The decision-making, of course, is a multidisciplinary decision. It's not one person who makes a decision at a PPT. But the notion is there is a building administrator that requires to be there as best practice. So
the
yes,
benefit maybe for our viewers is that like there are legally obliged people to be in a PPT that must be present at that time.
yes, but
And
if
I
the
don't know, I
school-
would look for the administration of whether this is a better way all around to staff the PPT.
At about 350 hours of doubling up on meetings,
Can you speak in?
There's something wrong with your mic.
Yeah.
Did you kick the wire down below?
I may have. Superintendent sits in a bad spot.
I think what Dr. Adley was saying is that 355 hours are with both people in attendance at all those meetings.
Okay, thank you.
Look, it is definitely much more efficient. And look, I'll tell you from my own experience and the experience of other superintendents and other schools that I know that do this. In addition to, well, actually, Shirley has said something, but I would just say that there is a greater responsibility for the actual complete process of the PPT. There's a greater responsibility for readiness for parents and accountability. There's a greater responsibility for implementation and follow through. There's less duplication. And it's not even talking about the meetings themselves. We're talking about $144,000. And so basically just less than $30,000 per school for the trade-off that you get. And I will say this, I think if there's a concern also that maybe we're separating things, right? I'm going to argue with you that it's actually the reverse. You're actually making it more inclusive actually by doing this. But I'll leave it at that because we can talk more at another meeting about it.
Well, could you press
Or
upon that? Why you think it's more
okay,
inclusive? Because
okay.
we've heard that question.
Sorry?
Could you press upon why you think it's more inclusive? Because we have heard that question from the public that this might not be promoting inclusion.
Well, in many ways, go ahead, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. I would, and thank you for the question. So currently you have a SES facilitator, and just so you know, we have some SES facilitators are teachers, special education teachers. We have a speech pathologist, we have a psychologist. So they can have one, they happen to be, those are their disciplines. But it's really limited to what they do at the meeting. They don't have the authority to go in and follow up in a classroom. They don't supervise, they don't evaluate. If you have an assistant principal there who has the authority to do that, she is in those general education classrooms. Remember that talking about inclusive, most of our students receiving special education services, the majority are supplemental. They have supplemental services. They're in the general education classroom the majority of the time, and they have resource room related services, and in some cases outside the classroom. But the inclusive piece is that that person would have the opportunity for enforcing both in the general education classroom and in this special education or related service environment. Right now, the SES facilitator, and I'm confident they would like to have the authority to do it, but doesn't have the authority to follow through in those environments in a supervision or giving that authentic feedback. So they can't implement what they've helped to design. They can collaborate, they can participate, but their implementation doesn't have the same opportunity. So I think it is more inclusive in the way that that person is in both the general education classroom and the special education services and works with both teachers in both environments.
Thank you.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So building on that, I also would, and this isn't for you, Shirley, it's more for at the elementary level. I would love to hear, as time is freed up for the assistant principals and the principals, for those meetings that they're not necessary for them to attend. How does that transform their role? Their time is freed up, and I know there was talk that they would be spending more time in the classroom, but I'd really like to hear more about that. This is changing the facilitators to an administrator is in my mind a big move. So I just would really like to hear, as we get more administrators in these buildings, what are the other administrators doing as their time is freed up? And my other question is, in terms of the switch from a facilitator to administrator, does the existing staff have those credentials to make that move? You said that will be posted, but will some of these people be able to maintain their roles in the schools, or are we looking to hire 5 new people?
The second part, Ms. Ritchie, is yes, several of them do have the 092 and the credentials for it. They also know we've had the conversation that it will be an open posting, so there may be other outside candidates, but several of them do have the 092.
Mrs. Stein?
First a comment, then a question. I want to echo Shirley's statement. I think I may be the only board member who was here when we put the SES facilitators in, and their initial role was to facilitate and deal with compliance, but I do remember the discussion was they would potentially become administrators. So here we are, and I understand why we're here. My question is for Rich. In terms of the cost, it's 146-ish. Can you just speak to costs in future years, other ancillary costs, benefits, et cetera?
Sure. So the administrators, unlike the teachers, don't have step within their contract. And so one of the things you see with teachers is there is larger year-over-year growth because the teachers get a general wage increase plus step, whereas administrators are simply their GWI. So if we look at the GWI that was approved in the recent administrator's contract, it is a 2% each of the next 3 years. And then that third year of that contract, their premium share is 1% higher than what the teachers currently pay.
Mrs. McCammon?
Yes. Shirley, can we push a little bit on the idea of more implementation? And I'd like to push a little bit in the spirit of understanding. So why are you saying that we're not implementing what we would like to be implementing today? Is it not possible that when something comes out of a PPT that it gets implemented the way that we want it with the existing structure? So I want to push on that. And sorry, I had a second part that's related, but it'll have to come back to me.
So if I may start with that, Jill, so I'll just give an example. That's probably the best way to do it. And again, I think it's about efficacy also. So if I'm a SES facilitator and I'm really looking at the goals and objectives we've developed, and I have those expertise, what I think good instruction should look like, and I'll just use reading as an example. And I really have an idea of SDI. I know how I can implement those goals. I know that as a SES facilitator, I can go speak to the teacher and then speak to the assistant principal or the principal and share my expertise. If I'm an administrator in that same role and I'm at that meeting, I'm already in that classroom. I'm giving authentic feedback. I'm providing those opportunities, and I have an opportunity with that teacher to really work directly, or psychologist or related service provider. Peer-to-peer doesn't have that opportunity because of accountability, because of walking in. I mean, to go back to Ms. Ritchie's, just to be a little tangential, to go back to Ms. Ritchie's question is, what will principals and other APs do during that time? And I know we did put it in our narrative in terms of instructional leadership. If you ask principals, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but this is true, they want to be in classrooms. The best way to improve instruction for instructional leadership is to be in classrooms, and it will provide that opportunity. And they will all raise their hands, I'm confident, and say that's where they want to be. So as an AP in that PPT, I now have the opportunity to go right into that classroom and to do what I know to do. So that's my, and I believe the SES facilitators would say the same thing, that they don't have, their hands are kind of limited and don't have those opportunities.
Mr. Sini?
Rich, to Katie's question, is there any way you can put the percentage increases in an absolute dollar in year 3 or something, just to show
We
what
could put a schedule together.
did I miss that?
Oh, we could put a schedule.
Oh, sorry.
together and send it out.
So,
Sure.
so what that 146 looks like in year 3.
2 and 3, yep.
Yes, thank you.
Mrs. McCammon, did you have a follow-up?
I think this might be for Julie too, but from a practical perspective, one of the worries coming out of again, the past number of years was also how we integrate successfully between special education and general education. And so if you've got a vice principal of special education who wants to pursue a path that general education isn't interested in, that would be the fear, right? Can you talk a little bit about how this can support better work as opposed to 2 different tribes competing with each other?
Sure. And I don't think that anybody sees it as 2 different tribes. I think it's what can we do to meet students' needs? How can we help students learn and make sure that they are achieving to the best of their potential? So it just expands that opportunity. As Shirley said, it gets more administrators into classrooms with teachers to provide feedback and to look at all kids and to just say, have you tried this? Or think about trying this. We have teachers who are, new to the profession, and we have a lot of different strategies. We're always expanding our toolbox. So there's always new things that we are learning about and strategies that we can try. And when an administrator can go into multiple classrooms, you can say to a teacher, go look at this classroom, or look at this practice, or, this student is just like the one in your class, and this teacher came up with something, I just saw it and I want you to see it. So those are the kind of opportunities that really help marry those two, regular ed and special ed.
Mrs. Achman?
So while I wasn't on the board, I was active when we brought these test facilitators in, and we were having the debate in the reverse. There are a lot of people saying you should be bringing these in as administrators, people saying they should be teachers. And I guess what I would say, I think for the board to consider is we've had them in now and we've learned more. It's not a theory. The debate back then was what's a better theory for this, because we had never experienced it. And we do now have an experience. So I've really been wrestling with this kind of thought process, but I do think if what we're hearing is we've had this experience and this is a better way for kids to go, and then it looks like fiscally, and maybe we can look at the schedule, it's also a strong way to go. I think that's something for us to consider. Kind of, we've lived this every day now, and can we improve upon what we know? That's what we're doing in all the other areas of the budget. We're trying to improve on what we already know. So that's at least where my thinking has been on this, because it was new to me when I heard it based on our old conversations about this. So I think as long as we can hear that this is what we've learned and it's going to serve children better, then we should really take a good hard look at this.
Go ahead, Dr.
Oh, sorry. I won't open up Pandora's box, so to speak, but I will just a wee bit. It's not as if it's a foreign concept here. You've got department heads at the high school and middle school for special education, right? That assume some roles. That's an administrative position. So it's not as if it's a foreign concept completely.
So I think part of the pushback we're going to hear, and I'll just be anticipatory, is that we often hear what do you need all those APs for? You're administrative heavy. What do you need all those APs for? And I think that's why Mrs. Parent's request is so important. Let's see a job description. But I think then it's going to be incumbent upon us as board members to say, well, because we found they work better. Our department chairs have proven real results. Our SESs we've had as teachers, and they've been able to do X, and now we're thinking we can push them to the next level.
Well, let me just be also honest and say it's replicating that a wee bit, but it's actually less expensive, and actually you're getting the actual. I'll just be honest, the actual title of the assistant principal part is not only not less expensive than the department head scenario. It's actually, I think you're getting more for the trade-off for the investment that you're making. I don't know if that's completely obvious, but you are.
I would also add too, I think as we come out and continue in this year and go into next year, I think we have the benefit of Dr. Adley coming in as a new superintendent. As Tara and Mrs. Stein have mentioned, this has been an evolution, and you should learn, grow, and develop the right program and have the right people in place. And I think that's what has happened. I also think we made the right decision and investment on adding the psychologist. I think we have to think about the remediation and the work that's going to have to be done over the next year or so with all our students. And I think we're adding the right people in the right roles to make sure we have the support for students. So I think that's also a big picture view of how we have to look at something like this. Mrs. McCann?
I have a non-facilitator question if we are ready to take others.
Well,
Okay.
that's good point. But while we have Julie on board and while we're in this discussion, any other further conversations at the board level around what we've been talking about? All right, Marge.
I just wanted to say, because I may or may not have written the job descriptions in Westport for the two assistant principals, they are exactly the same, except one has a primary focus on special education and one has a primary focus on SRBI.
Mrs. Parent.
So just to follow up on that, so I guess the question is then, the current AP, how does that role change now that this?
Yep. Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you, Julie. I'm sure you're staying on board with some of the other folks. We'll move on and continue with questions about special education. Jill, Mrs. McCammon?
I am specifically curious about how we are in our ability to anticipate what might be increases in service or compensatory services. And I think I see that you've looked at pupil evals. I'm also curious about ESY and whether or not we're expecting a bump in the cost there, because people may try to use the summertime to make up for some of the losses of the past 9 months or so. So are there areas where we've specifically looked in the special education budget to anticipate what could be coming down the pike? And if not, I just wanted to understand how we're looking at it. Thank you.
May I respond to that?
Yes.
Thank you, Jill. Yes, we have, and we do anticipate increased costs for ESY. That will be an opportunity for compensatory or recovery time. And in the budget that we have, because it starts on July 1, for contracted services, for speech and language, versus the other ESY budget, we have anticipated there will be additional costs.
Go ahead, Mrs. McCammon.
So Shirley, just to clarify, you've anticipated there'll be additional costs and they show up in this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So just building on that, so I just echo Jill's comments and concerns and just make sure that we have enough in there and don't hold back. So we want to make sure that everything that you need is there. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Additional questions or comments from the board? Mrs. McCammon.
Also on the subject of anticipating, if we do move forward with the reduction in team teaching, whether or not there's any areas in the special education budget that might need to be augmented accordingly. That was another question. And then I have one more.
Go ahead, Mrs. McCammon. Oh.
And then my last question is just whether or not, it looks like our out-of-district tuition is relatively steady, a small increase. Are there any trends that are coming out that are any different from things we've seen in previous years and where we need to be thinking about investment, or investment may show up in this budget? For example, we've decided that we need to increase training in XYZ area because of something we can see from outplacement or otherwise.
May I respond to that?
Yes, Mrs. Klein.
Jill, I think we are stable. I think in terms of our out of district, we're always looking at building our programs and looking at, I know a question came up earlier of looking at how we can support different levels on those tiers. Also, middle school came up earlier when we were speaking about opportunities for in-house programs. So we are continuing. The trend right now we know also is that we're not recommending any new programs for next year, but we are looking at that middle school time because there is a high incidence of some social emotional factors that we have to consider. So we are just going to be studying that and looking at that this year.
Mrs. Achman.
Sorry, my book is readjusted. Can we look at our contracted occupational therapy and physical therapy costs? Because I see that we're budgeting down, and I understand that you've explained that that's IEP driven. But each year we budget, and I feel like each year our actual experience is higher. Are you truly comfortable budgeting down on these two items, or less money?
And you're right, we were always apprehensive because then new PBTs come up and there's additional services. I'm always apprehensive to say we're confident, but we really did look at where we are right now, as in our where we are in terms of our what we've incurred. So I feel confident that we are there. Again, PBTs happen, new kids move in, it could change, but I'm confident that based on the information we have, it seems appropriate.
And can I ask one follow-up
Yes,
on
Mrs.
that?
Achman.
And then, so contracted speech, which is always my favorite category to talk about, we're seeing an increase, and I see that's driven by also by IEP. Is there any common theme we're seeing that's driving that, or are they all individual enough that there's nothing we're kind of missing programmatically?
I don't think we're missing something programmatically. I think the increase on that, again, is based on we're looking at delivery of services, frequency and duration because of missed opportunities during school closure. And that trend does, and Tara, your question, that trend does seem to increase. We have more and more children coming up from EL program into our DLC programs as well. And that's increased services and consultant fees happen for contracted speech as well. So I think the trend is we have more kids staying in our programs also. So I think in our specialized program.
Okay. Well, I love hearing that. I love hearing that we have more kids staying.
Yes, we do. We do.
Thank you, Mrs. Klein.
Any additional questions or comments from the board on RC 24 special education? Good dialogue. Michelle, we'll open it up to our other boards.
Committee members, please raise your hands at this time for any questions. We'll start with Courtney Darby. You are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you so much. I did want to raise some very serious concerns related to this proposal of sort of making the facilitators vice principals. I think the concerns that we have are that I think there are real concerns about inclusion. I think the role of all of our administrators, our principals, and all of our vice principals should be that they really understand all learners, and it's everyone's job to have a role and understand disability services and understand neurodiversity. It's absolutely critical, just like it's important for all of them to understand cultural differences, race differences. It's really important. I think the role of these vice principals will not be the same. If you think about it for a second, the time it will take for one vice principal to do an extensive number of PPTs will be extensive, and it will definitely take a huge chunk of time out of the regular business of vice principal duties. So I think that is also really concerning to me and to CPAC. The other thing I just wanted to mention was that many other districts in our DIRG in our area, and just we've taken a quick look and do not do it this way. They have one vice principal, including in cases where they have two vice principals, one is not specified for special ed. So I just think that's important to note. And I would love for the district to do a little bit more of an overview of what other districts are doing. But I know, and I certainly didn't look at every elementary school, but I know New Canaan, Greenwich, and Ridgefield, all the schools that I looked at do not have a separate vice principal for special education. And even in Westport, not all of the schools, elementary schools, have this. So that also kind of raises a red flag in my mind. Away from the vice principal, I think the other points that we just wanted to ask questions about would be OT. We are hearing that there are very large caseloads and need for makeups. And so concerns about whether or not there is enough here in this budget. Also for literacy and reading progress, where it's so critical right now. And we know children are behind because online learning is not the same. We encourage the district to consider expanding literacy has worked at the elementary level.
We also almost at time.
Okay, the only last thing was the same issue of remediation and recruitment and how critical it will be. And we don't see any additional, expenses for that. And we think there will be some. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Darby.
Jack Davis, you are unmuted and recognized.
I'm going to do two things. First of all, don't worry about trying to copy the comments that I have. I will send them to Dr. Adley and Mr. Deneen. But I also want to start with that I honestly do not have the educational experience or background to question this approach. I will say that there always will be a question whenever adding administrators. And because of that, I'm wondering, it might be helpful to have some metrics of how one will judge the success. As an example, if the 5 schools on average is using 355 hours for assistant principals at PPTs, what is the new goal of the assistant principals to be in the classroom by the number of hours? And how do we track that to make sure they're accomplishing what we say that they're about to do? One is a structural thing. We now have 2 school psychologists in each of our elementary schools. What is the reporting relationship between the school psychologist and this new assistant principal? Also, I understand that this will be a new job and therefore people will have to apply for it, but it would help us greatly to understand this if you might be able to forward the new job description so that we have that understanding. Also, as an administrator, and they've been the SS folks have been in the classroom working with students, and I understand they've been going to the PPTs anyhow, so that time was already occupied. But what are they going to continue their full role of working with students, just so that we understand what they're doing and what they may not be doing? As to the other expenses in RCs, more in the operating side, I understand from the write-up that we're trying to do a little bit of catch-up rather, on both the consultative services as well as contracted speech. But I'm wondering if you might be able to give us, and this may be for some of the other ones.
Time, Mr. Davis.
What?
You're almost at time.
I have one last question. If you might be able to give us, what is the increase in anticipated hours for these services versus an increase in cost? I'm assuming people have increased their prices since the pandemic. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Julie Best, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you very much. I have a few on this topic, and forgive me if I repeat anything that's been touched on already. I'm going to try to tick through this quickly. First, does this budget provide for a potential increase in psychological and/or counseling services to support students' needs, both for special education and general education students, as we re-enter a full-time in-person education model after this year plus of transition, remote learning, et cetera? Specific to the proposal to create assistant principal roles versus the SESS facilitators, the 2 schools that have DLC programs, and also looking forward when Oxbridge hosts all of the ELP programs, how will the role be different at those schools? We are hearing questions certainly about inclusion and how this will or won't affect that. We would love to see a job description and would love to be able to compare it to a job description for the SESS facilitators as they currently exist, plus a traditional assistant principal job. And why is this assistant principal on the special education budget versus in the elementary budgets? I think that captures it. And again, a number of things were already covered. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Best.
Taylor Carter, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thanks. Yeah, along the lines of a couple of things that have been said, I'd love to know more about, the capacity that's being created with this move with the SESS facilitators as it pertains to the existing assistant principals and what they'll do with that additional capacity. Further, I think along Julie's lines, I want to make sure that we've got a good handle on remediation type costs that need to be addressed, and do we have enough in here to absorb additional demand for services at the specialist level? I think it worries me that we're adding administrative heads and maybe not service related heads or hours. I don't know. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Carter.
Ms. Satori, you are unmuted and recognized.
I just want to say first that I'm supposed to be recognized after Jack Davis. I don't know what the problem has been, but anyway, I just want to say that.
Sorry, we try to change it up a little, which I explained. It's in no particular order, but we just want to make sure we get all the boards and committees that we work with. All right.
Okay, because I got skipped a couple times. Anyway, all right, I'll try to make this fast. I know that because this is a request for more administrators, there are going to be a lot of questions from our group. So I just want to make sure that, we do get the job descriptions. We do get a comprehensive analysis of how the program will look different when, if this is implemented. And also, I guess I have a concern after hearing from the folks at the high school about the lab versus the team teaching. I wonder if we would implement this assistant principal and then in a year or so find out that we have to go back to getting the SESS people also. So that's, one kind of big area. Also, we've had some questions about more detail about the consultant services. It seems to be quite a big chunk of the budget is being spent that way. I don't know if this is unusual or not, based on what's happened in the past few years. Again, the number of students in special education, I think you probably covered in your presentation a month or so ago, but how many kids are in district, how many kids are out of district, and what is the spending there? Also, the teacher aides, it appears that account 21603 is up, and yet the number of teacher aides is down. So that's something else that came up. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Sartori.
There are no more committee raised hands at this time.
Thank you, Michelle. I open it up to general public comments and questions about RC24 special education.
Jamie Zionic, you are recognized and unmuted.
Thank you. Jamie Zanuck, 15 Holmes Court, also co-chair of Darien CPAC. I'd like to follow up on what Courtney Darby said. I'm curious how in the district objectives, there was a contract with Maryland Friend to investigate co-taught teaching at the elementary level. And I'm curious with the specially designed instruction, how that ties in with the SES facilitators. I'm still very greatly concerned about the impact on inclusion. And as a member of the strategic planning committee, that was discussed for many hours. And I think this is a step backward for inclusion, and I don't support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Zionic.
Trisha Cooney, you are unmuted and recognized.
Okay, sorry, I gotta find me.
Ms. Cooney, you are unmuted.
Okay. Oh, hi. You can hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks, guys. So I was going to follow up Trisha Bresnahan, 11 Glenvale Avenue, and also a co-chair of CPAC. We wanted to remind that the RC, we brought this up last year too, and I know it's been brought up, but RC24 contains some service providers and some mental health providers that are for all the general education and also for Fitch and ELP. And another thing about the OTs having large caseloads is that kids can have as many as 20 missed sessions during the year, which can be really hard to make up with their schedules and without having to be pulled out of other math per se or something, and or having to make it up during the summer, which sort of doesn't make sense, having to cram something in like that. That's supposed to be helping them get their education during the year, to access their education. And if you made an analogy perhaps to AP Chem, if a teacher missed 20 classes and you had to make them all up at the end of the year, that would happen after perhaps their AP test, and that really wouldn't work. So I couldn't see that flying. And so I think more OT, I think that should be looked into. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mrs. Cooney.
Mr. Deneen, can I ask one quick thing while we still have Mrs. Klein?
Sure.
Mrs. Klein, I know you said that you planned for some remediation in this budget, but I don't know, unless you have a suggestion for us, how we could possibly plan for all that we don't know. So I'm hearing people say, I hope that you have enough money in here for remediation. I would imagine at the moment we have an estimate, but the possibility exists that we could have costs that are unforeseen. We're not even done with the school year yet, correct?
Yes, correct. We
Okay,
have
thank you.
anticipated, but don't know what will be in the forefront either.
Thank you.
And I think it's a great question, and it's a great question by everyone that's asked it. And I think we should think about what kind of regular update we want or need to see around what you're seeing in terms of remediation or needs at the school level, so that we can stay on top of it, whether it's a budget adjustment, appropriation, however it needs to get funded. We'll figure that out, but I think we want to make sure we understand what the needs are that are coming up that we need to address and make sure we're on top of. Thank you. Any other public comment?
There are no more raised hands at this time.
Great. Thank you for the great dialogue around special ed. We do not have one built in. We are literally on schedule to the point of having about 5 minutes. Do we want to take a quick 5-minute break and start back up at 2:45? Yes. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone online. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you. I didn't need to know that, but thank you. Ron? Thank you, everyone. Thanks for that 5-minute respite. We appreciate it. We are into the home stretch. So we will dive into a review of RC 19 curriculum.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is my very first Saturday, and this is almost a year to the day that I had my first visit to Darien. And depending on the day, it feels like yesterday or it feels like about 10 years ago. So I can't tell which. I do want to thank you and thank the community and the teachers and my administrative colleagues just for their tremendous support. This obviously has been a year like no other, and I feel like the only way that we've been able to do it successfully is this area of the budget is very supported by the board and the community. So just to give an overview, RC 19 covers the areas related to teaching and learning at the district level. There are some staffing positions that are built into the budget. Those include our instructional support specialists who provide SRBI services and EL services at the elementary level, our elementary program directors, as well as a stipend for our EL coordinator. And any increases that you see there are just contractual. Professional development is a large part of this budget, which is broken into different buckets. Some is toward consultant services. So next year we are looking at consultants in the area of teacher collaboration and equitable instructional practices. Those are connections also to where the spirit of the strategic planning work has been, and make some assumptions that that will guide the PD as we move forward. The big focus for professional development is really to bring together the investment the district has made in social and emotional learning. So far, in past years, we've had responsive classroom. There are homegrown lessons and activities, DBT, and there's some work in Ross Green's collaborative and proactive solutions. So this budget proposes the Ruler program. The Ruler program was created by Mark Brackett, who runs the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and it is a highly regarded research-based program that is really housed at Yale still. This is not in place of the work the district has done. This really is, I would call it glue to bring all of the good work together. Ruler is somewhat of an acronym, but it's more like an acronym with stems. So the R is recognizing emotions in self and others, and the U is understanding the causes and consequences of emotions. And I would say in general, that is something that we do pretty well already. And I think where we can improve and benefit from this approach is the L, which is labeling emotions, expressing emotions, and then regulating the emotions. One of the most powerful parts of the Ruler program is it creates a common language for the district to use. And it's done through starting training a team of teachers and administrators who become the experts in each school so the program can live on. So there is an initial investment in the training, but then it sustains itself over time. There have been lots of comments about the mental health is used a lot when we hear it in public comment, the psychological needs of students. And I would also extend that to, due to this year, adults have lots of needs as well. And what Ruler does is really brings together schools and communities. And I think it's a very smart approach for us to engage in starting next year. There's also an area for professional development and research and development, and that looks at new programs that we might possibly pilot. I also wanted to mention EL instruction. Last year, I know there was conversation about an increased FTE for EL, and that did not move forward in the budget, and it is not proposed in this budget. And so I assumed you might be wondering, why is it not in the budget? We did decrease by 10 students. So we had 65 last year at the time that proposal was made, and we were at 55 this year. And so since it was determined we can sustain the program and service the students as needed then, I think that's still the case now. The other part is textbooks, which there is an increase in textbooks, but I would also say for a district the size of Darien, last year's textbook budget was rather small. So even though this increase is percentage-wise a bit large, I don't think it's a giant textbook budget for the district. The biggest expense there is the 7-year biology textbook and the corresponding digital subscription that goes with that, and several AP textbooks, as well as some smaller numbers that really work to replace, it's not really replace, it's new instructional materials for added sections of courses at the elementary level. That's what many of those items are. So those are some of the highlights, and I'm glad to take questions.
Thank you, Chris. I will open it to board questions and comments. Mrs. Ritchie.
Thank you, Chris. I hope you're doing okay on your first budget day. For ruler, maybe I missed it, but is the cost of it broken out somewhere, and what is the ongoing future cost for that program?
So the ongoing, I'll start with there's flexibility depending on how we would like to begin. So I'm proposing that elementary does the first round of training. So we would have a cohort from each school. So it would be around $40,000 in the first year. The second year would be the middle school, high school. So we're looking more at about between $15,000 and $20,000. And that is not an annual cost. That is just the upfront training to send cohorts and then come back to the district where they serve as the experts and the trainers moving forward.
Mrs. Achman.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that? Ruler is so widely respected. Is there a reason why, given kind of our push on social emotional and maybe, at least from what we're hearing in public comment, the experience of a lot of social emotional kind of concerns coming out of COVID, that we would only start at the elementary versus doing some version of it at each level?
Part of it is managerial because it's sending many people to go do a training, and to make sure we can sustain subs and the coverage in order to do that training is part of the thought process. There's a larger upfront expense, obviously, so there's some decision making and trying to be as responsible as possible. I've wrestled with the same exact question though, of if this is the priority, should we try to go all at once?
So if you had the funds for it, could you manage it? Or even if you had the funds for it at this point, would it be managerially or operationally too difficult?
I would say with the funds and the caveat that we would be able to participate in enough trainings that are staggered perhaps. So we're not sending 40 people out of the district on a day, because we don't ever need to live that again after this year and subs, then yes, but it would depend on the schedule and availability of the training.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Stein.
Just a question. Last year, we had a lot of discussion about Project Lead the Way. I don't see it anywhere in here. I just want to confirm there's not a third year in this project. Are we done funding it?
Yes, there's no additional funding
Thank
needed
you.
for Project Lead the Way.
Mrs. Parent.
Can you just provide a little clarity as to what the $7,500 in field trips covers, just so we all are on the same page?
So that's a great question, and I'll give a little caveat to that, because the night that I was here for my interview, I spoke with almost every PTO rep at the elementary level, and every one of them said they can't wait to talk to me about field trips. And I've never had to have that conversation because there have been no field trips this year. So from what I understand from the history of it is grade levels tend to have 2 field trips, and those are paid for by the generous support of the PTOs and the parents in every school. There are certain instances when there is a 3rd field trip, so that budget covers the 3rd field trip. It also covers idea field trips, and any other special field trip is what I've gathered in the past. And where this conversation was left at this table last year was we need to continue to look at the field trips line. And I would agree, I just couldn't look at it ahead of today because they haven't happened.
Thank you. Mrs. McCammon.
So in addition to the social emotional work that we're anticipating coming off a pandemic, I think we're also anticipating some significant academic work. So I'd like to understand from a budgetary perspective, looking at the number of SRBI staff we have, looking at our curriculum development plans, looking at professional development plans. Embedded in here, do we have remediation work already in there? And then maybe more excitingly, do we have some things we were harvesting that we're excited to develop, as we started to talk about earlier, also embedded in here that I don't.
So with the SRBI piece, that goes hand in hand with the approach that we have to curriculum here. Since our curriculum is so responsive, we are really making adjustments based on where things are in any given year. So as a result of doing that, you don't end up with all of these students not where they need to be because the curriculum itself has adapted at a primary instructional level. So there are times that, especially in the area of EL, we're really pushed with between EL and ELA and EL, the same people servicing those students. And as the year goes on and more students potentially move into tier 2 and tier 3, it does get pretty tight. We try to adjust for that as much as possible as we go into the year by, we have some flexibility with staffing because there's 7.5 FTE for that area, that we can move someone on an individual year if we're anticipating that the needs are higher there. But that in hand with how we handle curriculum, I think that will manage itself. As far as what's exciting, I think that the way that course approvals is, I haven't been through that with you yet. So I just received those this week, and as those come out, I think there's some exciting opportunities there. And looking at STEM in general and how we are trying to be futuristic and looking ahead at, I'll plant the seed of really a STEM innovation center at the high school and how we can really build our programs to be state of the art. And I think exciting is the best word for that for sure.
Will that include a building committee? I hope not. No.
It depends on
exciting.
It depends on who you want to get their way and what that innovation center looks like.
Mrs. McCammon.
So I want to ask it again, just because I want to be sure that I'm clear, please. So in terms of curriculum or professional development, we believe that what we have currently will work because the model we have allows us to take kids, even if at a large scale, they're in a different place than where they would traditionally be. We've built a model that enables us to respond dynamically over time without major budgetary or operational changes.
Yes, that's how I put this budget together based on that.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Sini.
Chris, can we just talk about the line 22001 textbooks and looking back, 2017, 18, 19, 20, we had numbers in the well into 200,000, big drop, rise to 90. Then what's the trend line? What's driving that trend line and what's it look like going forward?
It tends to be a department, a book series that happens. And I'm not familiar if there's a textbook replacement cycle here. I don't think there is, and that would actually be atypical with a responsive curriculum model. So it usually happens when you have a $500,000, $600,000 textbook line, it's often because it's time to replace math textbooks because we've adopted a new series. So that recently happened, so I wouldn't anticipate anything new with math. And just based on this, we have science, biology coming as a singleton, so it doesn't happen in the department level. I could try to put together a forecast and talk to the department chairs to understand what I might be thinking about coming ahead, but I wouldn't be able to predict.
We did pre-purchase the math textbooks at the end of 1920, which was about 150,000 of that 292 that you see there.
But can I
Mr.
follow up exactly on that?
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
you may be going where I'm going. At some point in time, did the methodology change and some of these costs were pushed down into other RCs?
Yeah, that I would have to look back on. Just
Okay.
looking back at last year, though, that was the math.
Okay, Mrs. Achman.
So I think one of the reasons this number is so low also is that not only did we defer, we didn't go for the full 6 year. We went for the 3 year. Right.
No, we did purchase the 6.
So that, you went full 6.
But we pre-purchased it, so
And
that
we
expense is
pre-purchased.
in 1920.
So it's in the other.
Correct.
I knew there was something.
Yeah, but the other 2 years are still, we would have
well
to
into
200, we dropped to 50. I get to drop to 50, but it sounds like there were larger curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, just a little more color if you could, just as we look out even further.
Good, thank you. Mr. Brown?
Just for Rich, I see textbook replacements seem to be at the building level, but the new ones are in curriculum. Is that the way we've always done it, or is that?
So that has been the practice here. If you buy like a new program or like the new math program, it comes out of RC 19. Just typical like consumable replacements that happens at the school level.
Yeah, that's a typical way systems would do it, that the replacement cycles are within the departments, and then if there's any new text that have to come through, it would come through at the curriculum level and would show up here. And it's not uncommon for these to be low, and then 1 year it gets high because based on what's come through the process, basically.
Mrs. McKenna?
As we move forward through time, similarly, just as we look at how we use devices, I would love for us, whether we're talking about libraries or we're talking about curriculum, to just be very conscious of what our materials look like now that our kids are so much more proficient in computer use. Again, to the point earlier of not making changes this year, just budgeting for a year as normal, but I'd love for us to be talking about that from a trend perspective as we go forward.
I think I think what I hear too, sometimes there's got to be a meeting of, we're investing in this technology and online learning, yet we've still got these costs associated with textbooks. How, at what point does that curriculum cross over more to the digital world? And, how does that look?
Yeah, and that's certainly a reasonable question. And what sheds light on that for me a bit is the new software that we acquired as a result of COVID that we want to keep because it's been so beneficial existed before COVID. So these are tools that were valuable resources that were being used in schools all over the place, but we incorporated them as a result of trying to make a more robust remote learning system.
Thank you.
So that speaks to what those tools were originally for and how they work.
Good. I see your hand, Mrs. Stein?
No.
Okay. Any other questions around curriculum at this point for the board?
I just want to give a thank you to, I know my team is tuning in, all the department chairs and curriculum leaders. So I want to thank them for their help and support and developing my first budget here. So thank you, team.
Well, thank you for being here a year later. We're glad you're here. Michelle, I'll open it up to committees and boards.
Committees and boards, please raise your hands at this time if you have any questions. We will start with Jack Davis. You are unmuted and recognized.
I just have one question, and I'm not sure if this is the appropriate cost center. Last year, there was a discussion as to whether or not to continue the 9th grade IDEA program. If it's not here and was someplace else, can we add that to a discussion at some time? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Davis.
Clara Sartori, you are unmuted and recognized.
Okay, can you hear me?
All right, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay,
Can you
great.
Great. It appears that the program coordinators for elementary school are in this budget, line 1912058, but the department chairs 6 to 12 are not in this RC. Is there a reason? Especially since the department chairs no longer teach. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Courtney Darby, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. I know increasingly in the last month or so, we've seen letters to the editor about the need for better and more education about diversity. And I know the strategic committee had, as a goal, put inclusion. So I would like to ask about any professional development that we might be doing related to diversity and neurodiversity. In addition, I think another point would be just a little bit more of a comprehensive understanding about DBT at the elementary level. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Darby.
Taylor Carter, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. A couple of things. One, I see our budget for standardized testing looks flat or flattish. Because of all the disruptions to this year, is that enough? Are we going to have to execute any more testing? And number 2 was really more of a comment. It seems like there's a mathematical error in the lines for resource materials and ESL resources, 23004 and 006. The changes year over year look like they're kind of out of whack. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Carter.
There are no more raised hands for the committee members.
I will open it up to any additional public comment on RC 19 curriculum.
There are no raised hands at this time.
Duke, I'm sorry.
Yes,
I just
Mrs.
didn't
Achman.
sneak my other question in. Chris, or Mr. Tramberg, I know you answered Mrs. McCammon's question about a dynamic classroom, but within that, are we prepared for if we see more children who might need SRBI intervention, even at level 1, even though the classroom's being responsive, they might have skills that need to be captured?
I would say yes, and we would plan for that based on where we end up finishing up this year. We'll be able to anticipate that, and that'll inform some PD and how we open the school year next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Achman. We will move on to, thank you, Chris, appreciate that, and your team. We'll move on to RC 23, summer school.
So the summer school budget does assume a in-person Darien summer school, unlike the virtual one that we had in the current year. So you do see large variances in consultant services, teaching supplies, and then revenue. Overall, the cost center is a net reduction to the budget of $108,000 and is a revenue producing program. And we're assuming going back to the levels of about 2,400 kids.
Thank you, Rich. I'll open it up to board questions and comment. Mrs. McCammon.
We had some conversation about the summer school folks looking at possibly expanding and doing more virtual work and being able to take in more tuition. Is that in this number?
So we are, Caitlin and Mark would look at the option of having virtual classes as well. We really built it along the lines of just having that typical 23 to 2,400 kids in the program. So that's really where the revenue is. I think we probably need a year to see whether or not there's interest and whether or not that would grow.
Thank you.
Additional board questions or comments? Michelle, we'll move over to committees and boards.
Absolutely. Committee members, please raise your hands at this time for any questions. There are no raised hands at this time.
Thank you, Michelle. I'll open it up to any comments or questions on RC 23, summer school for the general public.
There are no raised hands at this time.
Thank you, Michelle.
Mr. Dean,
Yes.
you're beating me to committee questions before I can raise my hand. I have a question, I'm sorry. Rich, for the benefit of the public that's watching, can you explain kind of the accounting changes you did with summer school? Because I do think people looking at the revenue numbers are going to be a little shocked. Like we accounted differently for it.
Sure. So when the program first started many years ago, they just booked the revenue they collected when they collected it, as opposed to when the program was actually running. So in the 1920 year, that was really the optimal year to adjust it because of everything that was going on with COVID. So the revenue reflects the revenue that we would collect for that given program, as opposed to having 70% of that revenue in an old year and 30% in a new year, and then fast forwarding to the next one and kind of blending those revenues together.
Thank you.
Good point. Thank you. We will move on then to RC 20, finance.
So the finance department has implemented some new internal controls for purchasing and employee reimbursements. We have set up new vendor workflows with companies like Amazon, WB Mason, Staples, School Specialty to provide enhanced internal controls. We've also started using Munis a little bit more effectively. We used employee self-serve for open enrollment as an example. We use employee self-serve now for employee reimbursements, which has a workflow product. The budget does include an increase for the contractual annual audit with Bloom Shapiro. Other than that, it is pretty much static.
Thank you, Rich. You made a good case last year in terms of your overall team and structure of your department, and I don't see anything in here this year. Again, just want to make sure we understand what, if any, resources are needed there to continue to build efficiencies into the overall system of how we do business.
So we did make that reconciling change where we, at the end of last year, where we brought that new person on board in November. Just in the couple of months that that individual has been here, they did start working on setting up those internal controls, like I mentioned. So as an example of how that would work, currently like WB Mason, an individual could pick up the phone, place an order, and realistically you could bypass the purchase order process. So we turned off all purchases via phone. They actually have to go online. It actually gets routed into the finance office so we can actually see what's purchased. The actual item that can get purchased can now get uploaded into Unis, so you can actually go back and historically look electronically at what was ordered. And then it has another approval process where you have to actually make sure that there's a requisition and a purchase order attached to it. So we built in workflows in that workflow, whether it's WB Mason, we also applied it to Amazon, School Specialty, a lot of the vendors that our schools would use for some of those consumable items.
Great, thank you, Rich. Any additional board questions or comments around RC20 finance? Michelle, I will turn it over to any board or committee questions.
Committee members, please raise your hands at this time for any questions. There are no raised hands at this time.
Thank you.
Oh, I reiterate, Taylor Carter, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, just again, I see, and I only looked at the top line real quick, but there's no accounting for the change year over year from budget. Maybe I'm looking at this wrong, but I feel like we've got errors here. Yeah, it's not accounting for the change in the second line. Anyway, you got it.
Mrs. Carter, can you clarify?
If you look at the budget 2021 column, like for the top line, Director of Finance, 202,000 versus the recommended budget of 209, there should be a change in the column
So
to the right of that.
against revised budget.
You need to compare it to the revised budget, not the first column, Taylor, the third column.
Sorry, you're right. Thank you. Oops.
Good.
There are no more questions at this time.
Any questions from the public?
There are no raised hands at this time.
Good. Thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone. We'll move on to a review of RC16 administration.
So this is fairly straightforward. For those people who picked up books, there is the cover page introduction has been modified, so that's not the case. If you have that, the board has the correct version in front of them right now. But there's very little to be noted here other than legal services has been reduced just to reflect the fact that negotiations for next year, we've gone through a number of negotiations and we don't anticipate having to expand the expenditure listed. It's fairly straight. There's really no other change other than that.
Thank you, Dr. Adley. I'll open up to board questions. Mrs. Parent.
Dr. Adley, in our initial narrative, there was a communication specialist, and is that something that you're going to bring back next year? What's your thinking around that?
So originally we were anticipating we perhaps restructure to some degree and including it in a restructuring. So we're continuing to think of how best to do. We're always restructuring, as you can tell, right? That didn't come out through the process at the end of the day, but it certainly was an indication of some of the thinking that was happening.
Thank you.
And continues to occur.
Thank you.
So-
Mr. Sini.
I'm going to channel Mr. Burke here. Look at that legal services line. When I look at the progression 2017-18 and 18-19, then we have a dip in 19-20 budgeted. And I also look at what we spent to date. I guess my question is, can we cut this further? This line item further?
Well, we did a bit of analysis with it. This is what we feel comfortable with right now. I don't want to, Rich, if you want to give any other color to that, but I don't know if it.
So part of the dip 1920 again, we were closed for part of the year. While it's actuals through December, it doesn't correlate to bills through December. Law firms tend not to bill promptly. So it is actually a few months. We did take the reduction because, as Dr. Adley did mention, we don't have any collective bargaining agreements going into the future. The legal rates also go up as well as we saw last year.
So don't extrapolate this year's run rate to, okay, thank you.
Mrs. Stein?
Can you just give a little color to the demography report? When did we last have one? What
We just had the demography report, and
That's what I thought.
and we actually are committed. We'll say we're committed, but we've certainly made the decision to have it every year to work off the best and most accurate information. So they will come before the board every year.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I thought we had just done one.
Mrs. Achman?
Two things. One, as Mrs. Parent noted, we had got some new budget book pages today, and this was one of them. So will those go up online as new pages? So usually members can get it here and switch, or members of the public. So we can make sure they get that. So later in the process, there's not confusion. And two, why would we have a demography report each year? Like if usually we space them out over 2 or 3 years. Or what benefit would it be to us to expend year over year?
In terms of developments that are going up, things that actually change through the process, there's a confidence level of every year. At least when you're doing it every year, there's a good confidence level in actually those numbers. Now there's certain. It wouldn't be uncommon for some district perhaps to take a year or two or otherwise. That's a decision to be made, but it takes away some of the speculation, and it certainly gives the latest information and data to go off.
Sorry, what line item was that?
Consultant service.
12001. So maybe if we could get an update on like what we've done typically, because I don't think in Darien, and I'm not saying this isn't a new way to go, but in Darien, I don't think we've seen it every year. But maybe it's fair now that we do, given all the construction. I haven't formed an opinion about it, but this is new to us that we do it every single year.
It's also not unusual for school districts to give it every year, right?
Yeah. So I'm just saying for our experience, if we just kind of know or why we should be changing, that would be helpful.
Since I raised it, can I ask then a follow-up, Rich? Can you just tell us the actual cost of it?
It's about $10,000. It is typical in most lower Fairfield County districts to have a demographer every year.
So I'm sorry, what was that, Rich?
It is typical in most Fairfield County districts to have a demographer every year.
The dollar amount in this.
$10,000.
Thank you. Mrs. McCammon?
I think this coming year in particular, we were excited because they're expecting to have some census results. So even if we decide a different practice, irrespective of our neighbors, I think for this year with the census data, they were really recommending this was a good year. Does that report include, I know it's hard, but does it include ELP data? Are we thinking, is that priced in there? I know it's hard to predict.
Well, currently I believe there was 90 students, but moving forward, I think it is very hard to predict. As is kindergarten, if there's an area that's like you wanted for kindergarten, but if there's a grade level, it's most hard to predict. It's a younger grades. I think moving forward, if we could, as much as we could do there, but I don't think they actually. I would have to check, but I don't think they actually do the actual ELP type grade level. Are you familiar with McBroom where they actually do the ELP? I don't think so.
Typically, they can't get information from the preschools at that time.
That's what I thought.
Usually, their focus is really on the kindergarten level, which is variable.
Additional questions or board comments on RC 16 administration? Michelle, we'll move over to you.
Committee members, please raise your hands at this time with any questions. There are no raised hands at this time.
We'll move on to public comment.
There are no raised hands at this time.
Okay, thank you. We will move on to a review of RC 18, Personnel and Human Resources.
So many of the items in my budget are, actually determined by other people. So, so I'm going to defer to Rich on a lot of this. I can speak, and I think Dr. Adley would like to as well, on the teacher in residence program. I attended a really exciting webinar with CREC, the Capital Region Educational Council, about bringing minority candidates to schools. I know I've been speaking to the HR directors in Fairfield County, And they have also put teacher in residence in their budget. So we commit to a teacher being with us for a year. We pay them the equivalent of our paraprofessional salary with benefits. We pay them a $1,000 stipend over the summer so that they can continue their work and hopefully not need to get a job. That $1,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but that's what the plan is. And then we pay a partnership fee to CREC for the work that they do supporting us and a stipend for a mentor teacher here. And so we're hoping that we can begin to attract minority candidates, and they'll have a group to be with and to support each other in Lower Fairfield County.
Anything additional on this RC, Alan? Dr. Evans?
No, I just think that's a good, just an introduction to how also we're continuing to support, as it's come out through public comment and so on, the diversity initiative. And these are powerful ways to share what we're about or a direction we're going or what we value. They may not be huge in value in some ways, right? Or you can look at it and say it is a huge investment financially, but unless some policies and practices and decision-making changes, not much is going to change in some ways. So it's a way to show support for these things in this arena, but and we would like to do two. We cut back to one, just honestly, to try again. If we added everything back in that everybody said was good ideas today and so on and so forth, well, I wouldn't be bringing a number of 3.99 in, So that being said, ideally, it's nice to have company, and I say that very, very respectfully in terms of the program that we're supporting. And I think the same way as Dennis talked about the young children coming in and being across and fully integrating them, it's nice. It's certainly nice to have a companion in this capacity. This does not represent that.
There's no limit to 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's strictly
no.
driven by your thoughts about what the district.
No. Yeah. Honestly, these are way to introduce and begin to support, and over time continue to support perhaps more aggressively and more comprehensively.
I will open up to board questions. Mrs. Parent?
Thank you. Just continuing on this teacher in residence program, is there any guarantee that this person would have a job the second year with us, or is there's no, how does it work?
We are essentially guaranteeing the person a position, provided, all things being equal. They're going to be working with a mentor teacher. That's the intent. The intent is, it doesn't mean to say you absolutely have to. If things happen, right? But that would be the intent.
Mrs. Stein?
Rich, could you just provide for us later, you don't have to do it now, if we were to add a second in, I assume some of these costs would be redundant for a second? Or
No, it would be about the same.
It would be
The
the
partnership
same.
fee you have to pay
So
per teacher.
So everyone needs their own mentor. Let me ask a question then about the partnership fee, because that's significant, over $10,000. Would that be?
It's per teacher.
And what are they providing exactly for that amount of money?
So they help us to advertise and promote the position. They work with the students. So this is concentrated coursework that's offered through CREC, because one of the barriers to minority candidates receiving an education degree is the cost of going to school. So CREC has developed a whole program that gets them through the certification process, and then they support them throughout the year and the summer, and then help in the job opening in the event that we don't have one.
So do you see it as a multi-year investment? Then if you're doing one this year, what do you envision in future years? I think it's amazing. And from the strategic planning committee, it is very clear diversity is something we need to address. And this is an excellent way to start. Personally, I'd love to see two. I think having company would be great.
I think if the board can financially afford it, from the minority recruitment sessions that I've attended, the single largest barrier to districts like ours attracting minority candidates is that people don't see anyone who looks like them. So if we have the money and we can do it, I know that we have teachers who would be thrilled to participate.
March, I didn't hear the single largest barrier, and then I didn't hear the,
For minority candidates to come to districts like ours in Lower Fairfield County, a high-performing district, is that there are no candidates who look like them here.
I do think if we're going to invest in diversity and make it should be a welcoming investment and one that makes sense and pays off in the dividends we're hoping and attracts more diversity in our district.
Thank you, Mrs. Stein. Mrs. Achman.
So Marge, Ms. Stein, what it sounds like, well, I agree with Katie. I'd like to see too, because I think it's nice to have someone to go into new places with. But it also sounds like we might be able to attract better and stronger candidates if the goal is to keep these people. If you're saying more people are interested when there's 2 spots available than 1, we might actually get a wider variety of candidates applying.
That's what the research says. And I think it's also important that the other Lower Fairfield County districts at least initially have it in their budgets as well. So it will create sort of a surge in the movement down here.
Interesting.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So just operationally, functionally, where would this teacher reside? Where would they be? Are they in elementary level, middle school level?
So it's for elementary certification. So that's where the program is right now.
Mrs. McCammon.
Couple of things. First, Katie, the $10,000 is about what we pay for an au pair matching fee, and it's a comparable service. I know it's not the same thing, but I just thought that might be of interest. That's about what you pay a company.
Is it what? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
$10,000 is about what goes to the company for the matching services when you hire an au pair. And
Okay.
it's a similar, they're providing some support, they're helping you match. So just in terms of another baseline. I am curious to understand, just so I can understand the program better, why it shows up as an incremental FTE versus someone who's in one of our classrooms that we're coaching. How does this person work in the building?
Well, so we are required to pay them a salary and benefits. So Rich has to show them, I believe that's why I have to show them as an FTE, even though they won't be actual teachers next year, but because they're receiving benefits and salary.
So what do they do?
It's like a student teaching, situation. So that we're not adding to our FTE, we're not adding a classroom, but they'll be working in the classroom with the master teacher all year.
Okay,
teaching.
comparable to an intern.
But they stay for the most part in that one class.
Thank you.
So they're paired with 1 teacher, 1 classroom. Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Sini.
Are they qualified as teachers? I guess I don't understand the program. I'm
That's
sorry.
part of the program.
Yeah.
So
So I guess what level do they come in?
They have to have a bachelor's degree. And, then they apply. We are involved in the screening process. So we'll make sure that there's a certain level, but it's a bachelor's degree.
And
That's the
then
requirement.
this helps them achieve their masters.
This will, yeah, they're all across their, you know what, I don't know whether it's an actual master's, I would have to check, but they would get their across their certification, sort of like the alternative route
Yeah.
certification that people can take. And they don't get a master's, but they get a teaching certificate.
Got it.
Yeah, by the end of the year, they'll have a teacher certificate through the courses that they've taken simultaneously while working under the mentorship of a master teacher here.
And then the goal of a successful program is that next year they would enter in at the lowest step
Correct.
as a teacher. Got it. Thank you.
Mrs. Achman.
So I think it would be helpful to the board to kind of have a full flushing out of what this
Sure.
program is. What is the candidate's qualifications? And maybe if you can draw some parallels to something like, how is this like or dislike a student intern? How is this? I think that'll help give people, so myself included, not just people, 9 of us, some understanding
Sure.
of the program.
Yeah.
Mr. Sini.
Yeah, I would love to understand why, because interns, we don't pay salaries, correct? Or they're,
We pay this.
is this equivalent to an intern salary then, or?
No.
Yeah, so I'd just love to understand
Yep.
the differences. I think it seems like a very interesting program.
Any further board questions or comments, Mrs. McCammon?
If in that discussion, would you also include an understanding of what additional supports might be required? Last year, when you all were in Hartford, I think there was some really compelling testimony from staff members talking about needing support when they go into environments where they are feeling different. So are there additional supports that we need to put in place? And if so, what are they? For all members of the community.
Any additional board questions or comments?
Can I just clarify when you say all members of the community, what do you mean?
Well, I think that it could be that it's just support for the candidate. It could be that there need to be some we need to prepare the community to have certain types of discussions.
Mrs. Parent.
I'm just curious if there's any sort of, what does CREC do? Is there any, support that they give? Is there a consortium, these people meet every Wednesday afternoon to talk together about their experiences? Or?
Yeah, they support them throughout the school year and over the summer.
Thank you.
Mr. Sini.
So I'm going to move on to other items, or did people want to stay on this program?
We can move on to other items.
So Rich, could you just talk a bit about turnover and walk us through kind of the assumptions? I know you guys are also building kind of a model, and it's still not.
Yep. So
doesn't have
we did track turnover this year. We had about 32 teachers who left. About 4 of them left, either maybe the week before school started or even post school started. We believe they left because of COVID and concerns about COVID. So it was really about 28 when you take those into account. So we're looking at assuming 28 teachers turnover on an average basis of a master step 19 to a master step 15. That would give you a credit on your budget of just over $608,000, which is almost $60,000 more of a credit than last year, and probably the most aggressive turnover credit that's been booked.
So you're basically using this year's trend and just taking it.
We're looking at this year's trend and kind of extrapolating those we believe left simply because of COVID, as opposed to just those who decided either to leave the district for another position or retired at the end of the year.
Is it a safe assumption to say the 4 teachers that left because of COVID were at the higher step?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, most of the 32 who left were at the high, but not necessarily.
Okay, thanks. And then go ahead.
So a follow up. So just so we know historically, what do we typically in a non-COVID period, what was our typical budget for turnover?
So for example, last year we were in excess of $500,000 in turnover. So we're looking at around the same. When you base it on the teacher's contract as the turnover, you should kind of see it incrementally grow every year because the steps change each year. And so that's basically what we've done.
Any further questions? Mr. Sini.
So I want to budget control. I know through my first year, Alan, you said this was something that you didn't have available, and I realized that this was part of the reduced budget last year. I guess I'll say that working at a deficit this year would become very accustomed to doing that, and and also meeting at a whim on Zoom and that sort of thing. So if you could justify, your need to go back to the run rate budget control versus maintaining the reduced number, that would be helpful.
Well, I would simply say that in this case, we certainly have used budget control, and the uncertainty of moving forward would not be the time. I would certainly recommend to touch it. I mean, that would be your main reason right there. It's just it served as well this year, and the uncertainty as to moving into next year still remains. So it would be a tough.
I guess if you could reflect back to your previous district and how you used to operate.
How it operated, the superintendent had to. Well, I'll just tell you operationally. If I had to in that case increase FTEs, if it was not special education, if it was special education driven, I didn't have to come back to the board and ask for FTEs, right? If it was non-special education and I had to increase, I would have to keep coming back to the board for. Now that got a wee bit clunky to some degree, right? So this provides a wee bit of space for that. But that's the way it worked. And then if that ended up in greater expenditures, perhaps it was an appropriation or otherwise. But that's operationally how it worked.
Thank you.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So staying on budget control, I guess as I look through the budget, I see there's 4 potential breaks in our budget. So I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to cut budget control. I won't vote in favor of that. I think it needs to be the 4 FTEs. And I think based on what we're seeing in the projections in the budget, it would be, I don't think it would be wise to cut that number.
Well, we do have a couple of that are sitting, a couple of that is true.
Mrs. Ockman.
So I'll throw my hat in the ring on budget control as well. It's one of the votes I regret that I made myself the most last year in cutting budget control.
It was one of the what, sorry, Kay?
One of the votes, I mean, that
Oh,
I
oh.
supported that I regret the most last year. I don't believe we have. I think that in Darien, I don't think it's a nice to have. And I say that respectfully to the superintendent. I think that it is really how we have well managed both our budgets and our sections and kept our class sizes low. And we've talked a lot today about supports and class sizes at the high school. And I think that that holds true at the elementary as well. So I actually think budget controls is one of our safeguards against making sure that we have adequately sized class sections, which seem to vary the most unpredictably at the elementary. So at the moment, I'm very careful not overestimating it, but we have at least 4 sections that look like they're going to break. So I feel pretty strongly that we should keep 4 sections, and or I think if the board feels differently, we should make sure that we know that, and so that we can have some lengthy discussions to get everybody comfortable with wherever we end up.
Thank you. Mrs. McCammon.
So John, is your question that we would potentially operate any differently, or is your question just we would go through a different set of timing if we needed an additional staff member or an additional appropriation process?
I mean, it's frankly, I see it as a slush fund. And we, we'll see how this appropriation process goes this year, but I feel like we set a budget that accounts for budget control. Sometimes we use it, but I don't think in recent, again, my history is limited, but maybe that's something we can look into. Have we ever dipped into the entire budget control? And I feel if there is a need to maintain those classroom standards, there's a very easy mechanism, or not easy, but there's a mechanism that we could go and work off the town's general fund to meet those criteria. Now, again, it's reaching out across to our partners on the Board of Finance and RTM to fill that need, but maybe that's a discussion we can have in the working sessions or something like that, how they would see it. And again, it's our budget, I get that, but this year we're gonna have to work very closely to get that appropriation. And the reason I go to that is because I love this 9-year operating budget history chart that you supplied in your summary, Dr. Adley, but this is actually even post the pre-buys, I think. So one of the requests I was gonna have is there any way we could get page 4 of that presentation before the pre-buys? Because, the 9-year operating budget history, even with some pretty small numbers, excluding this current fiscal year, we're operating at 340,000 after pre-buys and surplus. So it's an area that I think, my personal view, sorry, I'm gonna get off my soapbox in a second, but that can be cut. And we could add to some of these other programs to offset that. So that we had a lot of interest. So that's where I'm coming. That's where I'm coming from. Sorry to go on for so long.
So I think what would be helpful, maybe Rich could go back and just look at historical use of budget control so people can actually see how we've used it. And I disagree. I do not see it as a slush fund. I see it as our ability to hire staff and do it when we need to. So it's something that I feel pretty strongly about. And as Ms. Ockman said, I regret that vote because it's something, as someone who's covered this budget for 12 years now, it's something that I see as vitally important.
Mrs. Ockman.
So I think words are really important. And I would say that I don't think as a sitting Board of Ed member that I've ever created a slush fund. And I know you probably mean it like, in colloquial terms, but I do think if you truly feel that way, like
I think the quote was a bit of a slush fund. If I didn't say it, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I mean unallocated expenses.
I would just say I don't feel it's slush fund. I feel it's very important. We are personally liable if we create budgets that are not fiscally responsible. So I really feel it's a very important fiscal tool. But I think that it sounds like budget control. It should, maybe other board members should weigh in because I think this is an important conversation. And I don't want to have it at the last minute. I don't want to have it a conversation on like cut day of all of a sudden, let's go to one, right? And last year was such a strange budget season for all governmental bodies involved that we were having it in the 11th hour. So I would ask that kind of all board members at least weigh in sooner than later, because budget control, I find, is an essential tool to how we budget. And I think I would say that that 9-year return rate shows that we budget very closely and we return what we don't use responsibly.
I would add that my view is as to where we start to creep into day-to-day operational roles with the Board of Ed, and we hire a superintendent, we hire a professional. I think the numbers this year prove out we need some flexibility, and you get to that time of year over July and August where the administration gets data and they have to make decisions, and I don't want anyone's hands tied in terms of making a decision about having the right educators on board to start the year out. So, inserting an appropriation type process, I don't think is prudent. I think we have to continuously look at the numbers, and the budget control number may change each year as we get a better view of the run rate. This is an unusual year, but I think the numbers prove it out. And I think the superintendent needs to have the flexibility to operationally run the district.
I'm not touching it. I'm sorry.
I will just weigh in and say I'm not in favor of reducing it.
I'm
Mrs.
not,
Stein.
I'm not going to touch it.
Mr. Maroney.
Yeah, I think for me, what I struggle with is I think we've asked for this in years past, is just how often do we hit these numbers? So one, I think, deserves to be in budget control. So the one at Tokenique, where we're at one class, one student away from tipping point, but 4 seems a longer way, because I think our projections are fairly accurate year over year. So that's where I would just try to understand how accurate our projections are and how often do we hit the tipping point. And that to me should determine budget control, not saying, and then we determine what that magic number is. Is it 1, 2, 4 seems a little high for me.
Rich, do we have that history?
We can put together the history of the use of budget control.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Duke, I just want to make myself clear. I'm not saying cut it to 0. I'm just.
No,
yeah.
I understand that. No.
And I
think,
do feel.
to Dennis's point, you can see Tokenique clearly. I just don't want to get into getting into the operational decisions that July, August, June, the administration has to make about having the right teachers in place, having the right class sizes in place. I think it's always helpful to see a trend. This is an unusual year. I think, yes, if you look back over that 9-year trend and the dollars we gave back, if you want to dig into those dollars, they may be efficiencies we got over the course of the year in running the district, and not specific to what our needs were around hiring teachers through budget control. So I think we could break those two out also. Mrs. Ockman.
So I would also add that we have used this for paraprofessionals that come up unexpectedly due to IEP commitments as we try to manage a really tight budget now for needs 18 months later of children. And so, and it's not the idea that we give the administration this money just to spend it. When you utilize budget control, you must come back and make your case to the Board of Ed. And that's where I feel the case needs to be made. No disrespect to the Board of Finance, but going for an appropriation, asking them if it's appropriate, whether these children receive a teacher, is not their expertise, much like the taxation rate is not, and trust me, my expertise. So I say that respectfully to them, but I think bringing forward appropriations for whether kids need paras invites them into an IEP process that even we are kept legally outside of in certain parameters. So I think maybe Rich, maybe that's the best thing. You can give some color to how we spend this, because it is.
So let's look at the data.
Yeah.
So we did use it this year, and we used it for 4 special education.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I brought this up in the past, and maybe that's a broader conversation, that in terms of everyone understanding transfers and where the dollars are in the buckets, there may be some conversation around budget control for specific hiring of teachers, and then budget control for special ed needs. But again, I'm for giving the superintendent and the administration the flexibility to have and use those dollars as they see fit. If we need to clarify it into certain buckets, that's a conversation we should have also.
I will say that the flexibility that it did give me while having board oversight of that flexibility was very helpful. So I would say that.
Good.
And
Mr. Senior.
I just want to make, is it possible to get that 9-year operating budget history like before the pre-buys too? Okay, thank you.
Good point. Thank you.
Well, probably only for last year's pre-buys.
Last year.
And
you
I'm
probably
assuming
can
that's
do it.
all we're going to have a record of, Mr.
Yeah,
Senior.
I'm sorry, you can't go back further with that.
I don't know if the district
I
never, I don't remember
pre-buy.
pre-buy.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
I don't think we'll have the record of it.
Okay.
Maybe what we can do to try to give some color to it is, but it would be difficult to do what you're looking for as a straight comparison. But maybe we can glean some information.
I don't know if honestly, Tara, I wouldn't even know if I could commit to that. I don't know what the research was going to.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like,
I don't want a
think there might
research
be
project.
anecdotal information. We
Yeah,
can see if it matches.
sorry, I thought this was recorded information and just, was, you know, because I imagine there were a number of pre-buys.
From last year, yep.
In my recollection, the board has never approved pre-buy
In my
until this
time on the
past year.
board, we've never had the
So this is
conversation
the
about
first time it's
pre-buy.
There are
ever happened.
transfers, and you would have to identify what someone else is calling a pre-buy versus a transfer, and so that's where it gets very difficult.
There, I would agree. There are some transfers that we've never, in my recollection, we've never formally approved pre-buying with the surplus. I don't remember ever having.
There,
So I'm sorry, there's end of year transfers, there's end of fiscal year transfers. I'm just trying-
they're transfers. So my guess is what I can do is download my information, see if it makes sense, and the board can look at it and see if that's getting what John's at.
Yeah, I'm
happy to-
sorry, I'm not trying to like recreate the budget book.
But we're using a lot of different terms that, given your length on the board, are going to mean a lot of different things.
Right.
So we probably need to get the terminology right so we can at least know what we're all talking about.
Thank you.
Okay, good. I will open it up. Any further board questions or comments? Michelle, I would open up to boards and committees.
Committee members, please raise your hands at this time if you have any questions. We'll start with Jack Davis. You are unmuted and recognized.
First, I want to just ask a quick question on budget control. A number of years past, we were using 65 thou for the addition of a new teacher. I saw the grade level and the MA that's requested. So I'm assuming that we're now using 72,000 plus change for a new teacher. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Clara Sartori, you are unmuted and recognized.
Can you hear us, Clara?
Ms. Sartori, you are muted.
You may be muted. Can you hear us?
Ms. Sartori?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So as to the budget control question, I was there when it was started, and it started with an amount of money for 1 or 2 salaries. And that money was used on a number of occasions, and it was put there to avoid last minute anxiety over where the money would come from if we had to add a teacher in August, and we did. So that's just one comment I wanted to make. The other thing is relating to the CREC partnership fee in the teacher in residence program. It occurs to me, I believe CREC is a RESC, and Darien belongs to the CES RESC. I think that is correct. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wondered if CES has a similar program. It seems unfortunate that we have to pay, for a second RESC fee if, to get this teacher in residence. It seems like a good idea, but we already belong to CES, and I'm wondering, well, whether they would have a similar program, and why we have to pay to join, a second RESC. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sartori.
Julie Best, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thank you. 2 quick things. On the teacher in residence program, we are excited about that and look forward to hearing more about it. With the thinking that this is not only a valuable initiative for the district, but also for our students too. And on budget control, as many of you know, I'm the class size police, and I just wanted to mention, I think it would also be an interesting exploration to see how many years We had classes that should have broken and didn't, and perhaps budget control might have been used and wasn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Best.
Taylor Carter, you are unmuted and recognized.
Thanks. I just, I speak as one member of the Board of Finance, but one who has been concerned with some of these line items in the past. And I just want to say thank you so much for the clarity on turnover and the data that supports that decision. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate that. I'll just say, take this opportunity to say the transparency with which you've provided all your financial information since you've been here. So thank you for that. Budget control, I don't disagree with the need for flexibility. I think Dennis makes a good point that, if we aren't consistently using all four, maybe we can get away with two. And certainly we support you if the need be to, help you with additional hires if that needs to happen. I think that, in the past, the concern was, whatever we want to call it, pre-buys, that the money wasn't being returned, but with a commitment to have that money returned if it's not used, I personally, as one member of the Board of Finance, have no problem with that.
Thank you, Mrs. Carter.
There are no more raised hands at this time.
We'll go to public comment.
There are no raised hands at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
With that, we will move into our final RC, RC 28, COVID expenses.
Let me go back.
Yes, Mr. Maroney.
So going back to something Julie saying.
Dennis.
Sorry. So going back to what Julie was saying about class sizes, I think what would be interesting in this discussion about budget control as well is to look at the class sizes. This is one person's opinion, the rest of you can chime in, and to see how many times we were over the optimal class size. And not just did it trigger budget control, but then did the class grow during the year, and then we're in violation is the wrong word, but above our optimal class size. To me, that's an interesting number, and I think it's something CDSP has been talking about for years, and I'm struggling with it with this budget of looking at these two numbers where we're over our optimal class size, and we're not budgeting to break it, but two of the classes are going to be at the high end, right? And there's going to be one class that's at 21. So I'm questioning, and I'm not advocating for spending to hire new teachers, but I'm struggling philosophically on how to do this. So, but I think having a little more data on understanding the class size policy would help if we're going to do the work on the budget control.
So we could probably put together, at least certainly during my tenure for the last 2 years, just kind of how that played out. I don't know if I would have historically beyond that. I don't think, but certainly in the last 2 years, we can do that.
Thank you, Mr. Maroney. Right, moving on to RC 28, COVID.
Well, this is not built into the budget, but should we be in a COVID situation, this is just sort of outlining what it might look like. The expenditures, you've been down this road before, so we know what the expenses are this year. It's just looking at those and extrapolating what expenses might be, but it's not budget. COVID expenses are not in the budget.
So this is a forecast, a projection of what starting in September would look like if we had to continue in the learning model that we're in now.
Correct. If we're in the mode that we're in currently, this is what we're assuming we would need. It's additional teachers, additional campus monitors, custodial supplies, the LPNs, police, things like that.
Okay. All right. So I know there's been a lot of conversation throughout some of the RCs specific around nursing and other things. So I will open it up to board questions and comments. Mrs. Achman.
So I'm confused a little on this RC. And the only reason being why is if we needed to social distance, we would have to hire these teachers because as John pointed out before, these teachers are not currently in our budget. Like all teachers that were added because of COVID are not currently in the budget. So we would need to add back these teachers for the start of school. So are we saying that we're going to go forward and approve this budget? And then should we still be in a COVID environment, we would be before the Board of Finance asking for an appropriation to hire these teachers this summer?
Yes, I have not put in any teachers in the classroom section. So if it gets to where we're in a situation that we were in this year, we would be coming back looking for. I wouldn't be going. I personally wouldn't be going to the Board of Finance. I'd be coming to the Board of Education to say I need to add 3 teachers or whatever it happens to be, custodians or otherwise support staff.
So maybe supportive of budget control again, because we know that I guess my thing is the timing's super tight. I don't want to add these people in and unnecessarily inflate the budget and then all of a sudden have all this extra money. But I'm also very aware of the timing, having lived it last year. Last year we were in such an immediate COVID that we were hiring staff, and we're going to talk, I think, Tuesday about what our appropriation request process is with the Board of Finance. But I don't think we want to do that year over year. So I just don't know how to account for it. And maybe the answer is budget control again. But we have at least 5 teachers here that are possible, plus LPNs. And we would need the first day of school next August.
Yeah. And I think it's a discussion that we all come to an agreement and understanding how we're approaching this. This is, if we continue down the path and we end the school year and through July and August, we see that we're still going to have all these COVID precautions in place. I think that's where we're getting a view as to what it's going to look like. And then to me, the discussion is we get our appropriation in July. So we have the ability to go down the path of doing what we need to do to get schools open. And we go into the zone that we're in now of being in a deficit mode and having to go for an appropriation. I mean, that's the way I see it in its simplest format, versus than trying to build this into this budget or budget control today, since it's an unknown. But I think it's a view into what the future could look like if we go down the path of staying in a COVID school model. That's my view of it. Mr. Cini?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I just say it very likely will be a better scenario than this or a worse scenario than this.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that helps.
Let's go back to Mr. Cini.
I'm just saying that, the reality
Nobody
of it
take him gambling with
that
you.
is what we're living. But come the end of June, we'll have a picture by the end of June. But it could, depend on
I worry about the crystal. Look, would love the crystal ball and be like, we're back to a normal school year. I think the good news is what we've seen, the work the administration has done gives us a view as to what happens come September if we have to stay in this mode. But I don't think it is part of this budget approval process. It's an understanding of where we may need to go after the budget is approved, depending on how COVID plays out. Mr. Cini.
I agree with you, sir. And remember, if we set a budget that includes this, then it puts the burden on the taxpayer with a very big unknown, big question mark. So, I think it's great to highlight it. We've gone through this experience this year and it's helped you build this RC, but it's overly optimistic to think everything's going to be perfectly normal maybe next year.
Agree.
But try to budget around that, I think, is just a impossible task. So, when we deliver our final budget, it's going to have an asterisk saying this is based on normal times, folks. And we are likely not to do it, but to budget for that, it just seemed pretty tough.
Thank you, Mr. Cini. Mrs. Ritchie?
Yes, I agree with that. I don't think we're going to switch a light switch and then everything's going to be back to the way it was. I think we're going to be faced with some expenses and we have to walk the RTM and Board of Finance through that and understanding that here's our budget as we see it today. We will likely be coming for another appropriation because I honestly think we're going to have some of these things faced next year. My question is on the lunch monitors. I see the lunch monitors in here, but they're part of our budget. So should they come out of the COVID? Or we just want to keep it in there so we know that I guess I'm confused why they're in
We
COVID.
probably should take it out with the exception of the middle school.
Okay.
you will probably, it's a good question, but
Assuming it's approved.
you would probably, if we stayed in a similar mode to what we're in now, you would still probably have to add lunch monitors, correct?
Correct. I mean, assuming that if the lunch monitors are approved in the regular budget as is, we probably would be able to take them out of the COVID budget because you would have them, with the exception of the middle school, because there are no recommended middle school lunch monitors. The lunch monitors, for example, are not approved as part of the budget process. We would, and we're in a COVID environment, we would need them because you would have those auxiliary sites that we're operating now when the schools are open.
Okay, so what we're doing for this current budget cycle would work for us in a COVID learning model from a lunch monitor.
Correct.
Okay. Mrs. Achman.
So to be clear, I'm not advocating, and I agree with Mr. Sini, that we put this COVID budget full in our budget, because I think that burden would fall on the taxpayers. And I think that's why I said I'm not looking to over budget. However, if we are talking about flexibility and a year to be dynamic of all years, I think this year we had to run a deficit because the needs, we had never experienced it before. Next year, if we have no flexibility and we're backing into programs and running deficits again without having done any forethought for it, I think that comes at the expense of student programs. And as I think Mrs. McCammon and I have asked a lot about remediation this year, we know that's coming. So I think of all years, this is a year to certainly protect that flexibility. And I know I'm harping on budget control, but I feel so strongly about it that that's why I'm doing it. If we're looking at the possibility of 4 sections breaking, 6 possible new teachers, LPNs, I think we need to be mindful of that without really, with still pushing school forward and new initiatives forward, which is what this budget does. But I would be remiss if I didn't make the case then of any year for flexibility.
No, and I think it's a good point, Mrs. Achman, and I think this is something that we literally have to get insight from the administration, from the state, as we go through the budget cycle. I know it's a set cycle. There may have to be some adjustments, and it may have to become a little more fluid this year as we learn some things. But I do think it plays into budget control being even more important. I will tell you, I'm more, from this current budget cycle, I'm more worried about, and I think the recurring theme is, we don't know what we don't know, but are we preparing enough for what we're going to see and feel in terms of the remediation and the social emotional learning that's going to be needed? We're still learning and hearing, and we're going to be doing assessments and learning, but I am concerned, is there enough in there to, is there enough in there? I'll leave it at that. Mrs. McCammon.
I'd like to speak to the process first. I think I prefer that we keep our budget year over year separate from COVID in every way, including budget control, because I think this is, if the goal is to optimize flexibility, which I think it should be, this is the best way. Then you could probably go for, when you, as you can, one-time appropriation, be set up, get it cleanly. There is money in the general fund that could cover this full amount or more if we needed more. So I think what we would want to do is, from a timely, be prepared in a very timely manner and anticipate as well as possible, but that we should keep the budgets clean and separate from one another.
Thank you, Mrs. McCammon. Mrs. Parent?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So the tokenique third grade is one of the sections that could potentially break. If that were to break, would we still need to add an additional tokenique third grade teacher for social distancing?
No.
It's a lot of.
So that, Mr. Sini?
I just want to also say, we haven't been through this appropriation process or even an update on the COVID-related expenses. And by the way, there's probably a lot of savings we haven't seen yet as a board. So like, this only outlines, as I understand, the expenses, but like, we're missing sports, we're missing field trips. So it's going to be really interesting to go through this appropriations process, and then we can think forward with more data next year.
Mrs. McCammon.
Yeah, to that end, that's what I was wondering, if we want to model any potential lost revenue, whether that's summer school or fields or what have you. Again, I don't know that we can plan, but I had a similar question.
Any other additional board questions or comments? I think I had a line item here around nursing and health. When we got to COVID, I don't know, Mrs. Achman, you wanted to make sure we had additional conversation. Have we included it in this conversation?
I did. Give me a second.
So many hours ago.
So many hours ago. No, I think I'm sure what I was pushing on more is our need for nurses has been intense this year. They've done work above and beyond what anyone ever signed up to be a school nurse for, and I think we're grateful for that. So I think it all went back to the same thing for me. Like, look, I agree. I do not want COVID mixed in. I made that case last year. I made it this year. I'm making it this budget appropriation season when we go through this, or COVID appropriation season when we go through it. But I do think we have to know, what do we need to be most nimble on? And to me, it's teachers and nurses. We have to be most nimble on teachers, nurses for our kids should we need to. So how do we do that? But I'm sure that's where I was a couple hours ago.
Makes
If not, we'll be back here.
makes total sense. Okay, any additional questions or board comments? Michelle, can we move on to committees and boards?
Absolutely. Committee members, please raise your hands at this time if you have any questions. We will start with Jack Davis. You are unmuted and recognized.
Just one thing that I've mentioned in the past, I would like consistency on the handling of operating versus capital expenses. So in, even if it's just for information purposes, but in item 74030, emergency repairs for 213,000, I would hope that the Board of Ed is treating those repairs similar to how the Board of Selectmen has treated their repairs. And if they've taken funds out of capital, similar things should at least be noted. After that, I want to thank everyone for allowing us to participate in this way. And I'm going to get off so we can beat the time.
The good man from the RTM yields his time to the floor. Thanks, Michelle.
Clara Satori, you are unmuted and recognized.
Okay, I just want to thank you all for the meeting today. It's been very informative, and we'll certainly be seeing more of each other in the next several months. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just giving them a second.
Sure.
Julie Best, you are unmuted and recognized.
I too just want to say thank you. Good discussion. There's a lot of stuff we look forward to hearing more on, and appreciate you making this work. This was a sort of daunting task to undertake, I think, in this format. So thank you very much. I think it went very well.
Thank you, Mrs. Best.
There are no more raised hands at this time.
We'll go to public comment.
There are no raised hands at this time. Oh,
We'll
Jocelyn just popped in.
Give a minute. Mrs. Delancey, welcome.
I just wanted to know, are we having a separate public comment before the end, or are we ending at this public
We
comment?
will, thank you, Mrs. Delancey. We will have a public comment at the end.
Then I lower my hand.
Thank you. Thank you. No further questions
Not at this time.
specific to COVID-28. All right, thank you. I will open it up then for public comment.
Jocelyn Delancey, you are unmuted and recognized.
Hello, Mrs. Delancey.
Hi, Jocelyn Delancey speaking on behalf of.
Could I ask you to speak up a little bit, please?
I can try.
Wow, that's awesome. Awesome looking dog.
He's getting a little impatient, so I apologize.
Understood.
Thank you for the time and care that you have taken into considering the 2021-22 budget. I truly respect the discourse, questions, and reasoning behind many additions and cuts, and appreciate the difficult task of establishing a fiscally responsible and efficient budget. That being said, I would implore you to reconsider some of the cuts that have been presented today, as it seems that you are adding positions that don't have a direct impact on instruction of our students and taking away possible positions that do. The benefits described by the administration surrounding the positions proposed are valid, but they shouldn't come at the cost of positions that work directly with students. I'd like to take a minute to explain how vital the proposed cuts to staffing are currently to the students of Darien Public Schools. Our instructional paras are paramount in our support of students throughout the school day, especially in instances of larger class sizes. Instructional paras are the first faces our students see in the morning and the last ones they see as they leave. They work tirelessly in our classrooms to support students. Many help with small groups of children who need extra support. Most of the students that get support from instructional paras do not have IEPs. These students who could use extra TLC in order to meet the rigor of Darien Public Schools curriculum and who end up thriving with extra support of instructional aides. Most recently, our instructional paras have played a vital role in how we've been able to reach so many students during remote learning. They log onto our Zooms and go into breakout rooms with small groups of students and share the work with the general education teachers to support students while online. As we transition back into normalcy with these students, many will need more direct contact with teachers and support services, especially our students who do not receive specialized services through an IEP. Lunch monitors would allow for a prudent budget, but would not offer the same instructional support for students in school. Losing a library media specialist at MMS would also chip away at the direct services we provide to our students. The position has been at MMS for over a decade, and both library media specialists give support to the 1,000 plus students at MMS daily. The library at MMS is a place where students go throughout the day for support with projects, help with technology, and just to have the comfort and safe space of the library and its teachers. Not only do these two teachers support students academically, but they also support our teachers in our delivery of curriculum and our work with technology. Some may argue that other school districts only have one library media specialist in the middle school level, but we are not other districts. This program has been successful with staffing that we have. Losing this position would no doubt hurt our support of students at MMS. I'm also confused at how we can commit to reimagining our libraries, yet take away positions that would contribute to that work. You have asked great questions and about support in lab classes, so I'm hopeful that you have heard and recognized the need for the 0.8 history position at the high school. You have also heard a thoughtful and strong presentation from a library media specialist, someone who would lose the compensation for that work should you cut the stipends to library media specialists. Please know how much the DEA appreciates the relationship that we have with our board and administrators. Our goal in speaking up today is strictly to give you the perspective of the people in our classrooms with students and how we feel losing these positions would impact students. Again, please reconsider the cuts of positions that have a direct impact on the students of Darien Public Schools. Nash also appreciates you listening. Thank you.
Mrs. Delancey, that sounded like a call for adjournment, I think. That part. Thank you, Mrs. Delancey. Thank you very much. Any additional public comment?
Would you like me to give a couple more seconds to the
Sure.
public?
Again, we are looking for overall public comment on the conversation and rollout today of the 2021-2022 budget.
There are no raised hands at this time.
All right, thank you. Who'd have thought a year ago? I think we've gotten through what we've gotten through as a community. We'll continue to get through it as a community. Those of us that have been on the board or participated, you'd never think we'd be able to do this over Zoom when you remember all the amount of people in the room and taking turns speaking. So we accomplished that. We continue to move forward. I think I want to thank Dr. Adley, the cabinet, the staff, the teachers for all the hard work on putting together a budget that continues to deliver the excellent education we've all come to expect and continues to invest in for the future and look out for the care, social and emotional well-being of our children. I want to thank our partners on RTM F&B, RTM Education, CDSP, CPAC, and the Board of Finance for participating in all the good questions. We look forward to the ongoing dialogue as we go through the budget process. And thank you to the board for all the hard work of reviewing the budget behind the scenes. Thank you for our parents and all those that have participated. It's not easy on a Saturday to get through this, but we did, and we did it in ahead of time. So I would look for additional conversations so we can stay till the 4:30 cutoff. No, I'm only kidding.
No, I just want to say we miss having you guys all here in person. So hopefully
Yes.
next year when we go through this, we
I
can all be together.
I appreciate you saying that. There is something to be said about being in person. I'm glad the board and the cabinet can do that. But thank you to everyone out there. Have a good rest of your afternoon and a good rest of your weekend. I will motion for adjournment. Mr. Sini, second by Mrs. Stein. Thank you, everyone. All in favor? I didn't hear Nosh, the dog.